Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. The evening had been perfect, a last-minute road trip with friends, chasing the sunset along an old, winding highway that cut through rolling fields and endless orchards. We pulled off the road just as night began to fall, seeking the perfect place to stargaze. The clearing we found was surrounded by towering oaks and the scent of wildflowers, and we stretched out on blankets with our heads tilted up, drinking in the crisp air and the glittering night sky. That's when we heard the faint sound of music. It was soft at first, barely louder than the rustle of the wind. But, as we lay there, eyes wide with curiosity, it grew clearer. It was an old song, one with an ancient, mournful melody, like something out of an old folk tale. My friends exchanged puzzled glances, half-heartedly laughing it off as the wind-carrying sound from a distant festival or event. But when we stood up and looked around, there was nothing. Just trees, dark and still. I felt a chill slide down my back. Something about the way the music sounded so close but impossible to trace made my skin prickle. I turned to Sam, who was always the most skeptical of us, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than our imaginations. "Do you hear that?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sam squinted into the dark. "Yeah, but it's probably just some old radio or something. Let's not make a big deal out of it." But when we looked down the dirt path leading to the clearing, we noticed the shadows seemed to shift. The song grew louder, moving from the murmur of a lullaby to a deep, harmonious hum that sent a wave of discomfort through me. The crickets had stopped chirping, the wind had stilled, and the world felt locked in place, holding its breath. I glanced at the others, who were now starting to look uneasy. Just as we were about to pack up and head back to the car, the song stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, a different sound reached our ears, a low, metallic scraping, like nails on a sheet of metal. I froze. It wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling. Something in the air had shifted, as though we were no longer alone. "Let's go," Sam said, voice trembling. We grabbed our things, half running back the way we came, the hairs on my arms standing on end. We reached the car, our laughter strained and nervous as we tried to convince each other that nothing was wrong. We pulled out, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. But, as we passed the edge of the clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught my breath. A figure stood at the edge of the path, half shrouded in shadows. Its silhouette was humanoid but distorted, as if it had been carved out of the night itself. Its head tilted in our direction, and for a moment, I thought I saw its mouth curve into something that almost resembled a smile. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The figure disappeared from sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, following. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees whispering secrets as we sped past them, the sense of being pursued growing stronger. When we finally reached town, the streetlights felt like a promise of safety. We stopped at a diner and tried to calm down, sipping on cheap coffee that did nothing to chase away the fear. It was only when we looked out the window at the dark stretch of road behind us that we saw it again, just for a second. The figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. The waitress at the counter glanced at us, her eyes shadowed with a knowing look. "You're not the first to see him," she said softly. "They say he comes when the music plays." We left before dawn, but I knew I would never forget the look in that creature's eyes. It was as though it had been waiting for us, and now, I was certain that it would always be there, just out of sight, waiting for the next song to begin. I was out on a solo hike when it happened. It wasn't planned, just a spontaneous decision to leave my apartment and get lost in nature for a day. The forest was dense and ancient, with trees so tall they blocked out the sun and leaves that whispered secrets to one another in the wind. I'd wandered for hours, passing old trails marked only by fading footprints and gnarly roots that reached out like fingers. When I found the clearing, it was the sort of place you only see in dreams: bright green grass, wildflowers peppered like spilled paint, and an eerie silence that made everything feel suspended in time. I paused to catch my breath and took in the moment. But then I noticed it, a cabin at the edge of the clearing. It was small, with a roof that sagged under the weight of years and a porch that had rotted through in places, making it look like it could collapse with a gust of wind. The place wasn't on any map. I took a step toward it, heart pounding in my chest. Why would a cabin be out here, far from the nearest trail? Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the warped door open. Inside, the air was thick and musky. Dust curled in lazy swirls in the slanted beams of sunlight. The room was empty, except for an old rocking chair that moved on its own, creaking in time with the groan of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, but I could feel something in the room, something intangible and heavy. I stepped closer to the chair, and that's when I heard a faint voice, like a whisper threading through the walls. It was too low to make out, but I could feel it brushing against my ears. Then came the sound of someone shifting in the corner of the room, a scraping noise as if someone was pulling themselves forward. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just silence, deep and smothering. I was about to leave when I noticed a dusty journal sitting on a rickety table. I reached for it, the pages brittle under my fingers. I flipped through, reading bits of handwriting that had faded with time. It told the story of a family who had once lived in the cabin, a family that had gone missing without a trace. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. They're here. They watch. They wait. A loud bang shattered the silence, and I jolted, eyes darting around the cabin. The rocking chair had stopped moving. In its place was a set of footprints, freshly imprinted in the dust, leading toward the window. I rushed forward, but there was no one outside, just the forest stretching out, deep and dark, with shadows that seemed to twist and coil. I turned to leave, but a shadow flickered in the corner of my vision. I blinked, and suddenly the room was full of people. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped between this world and the next, staring at me as if I were the one who had summoned them. I stumbled back, heart pounding, when a hand brushed mine, icy cold and shaking. I yelped and turned to see the pale, twisted face of a child. "Help us," the voice whispered, echoing from every corner of the room. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, pressing down on me like a vice. I bolted, ignoring the splintered floorboards underfoot as I ran. The forest outside, once so welcoming, now felt like a labyrinth that would never let me escape. But I didn't stop until I was back on the main trail, gasping for air and looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them following. They weren't there. The woods were still, as if nothing had happened. I never told anyone what I saw that day, and I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that same whisper, telling me they're still waiting. I was never a fan of the old, abandoned amusement park on the edge of town. It was more of an eyesore than anything, a relic from a better time, rusted and decaying. But on that day, with the sun low and the air heavy with the smell of rain, my friends convinced me to go. We wanted something different for once, and what better way to kick off the summer than exploring somewhere creepy? We made our way through the overgrown paths and cracked pavement, the chirping of cicadas growing louder as the sky darkened. The entrance was flanked by two massive stone lions with chipped noses and vacant eyes. We pushed open the wrought iron gate, the hinges protesting with a screech that echoed in the silence. The place was a maze of forgotten rides. The Ferris wheel loomed over us like a skeletal giant, its seat swaying in the breeze. A bumper car track sat to the left, rusted vehicles tilted at odd angles. We wandered further in, laughing and daring each other to go deeper. It was around the fun house when I noticed the first strange thing. A soft, metallic thud came from behind us, like someone had dropped a heavy tool. We all turned, but the path was empty, probably just a raccoon, Lisa said, brushing her hair behind her ear. But I felt it then, a presence, a tingle that ran from the back of my neck to my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I glanced at my friends, but they were too busy poking fun at each other to notice. We pressed on, past a derelict clown stage where torn posters flapped like restless ghosts. The wind picked up, swirling around us and making the plastic banners snap like whips. Then, without warning, we heard a low, groaning hum that seemed to come from deep within the ground. "What was that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath us shuddered. I stumbled, grabbing for the nearest rail. The whole park seemed to shift, as if a giant had taken a deep breath. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went still. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice more urgent than I intended. But they didn't hear me. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the Ferris wheel. I turned to see what they were looking at and my blood froze. The wheel had moved. Just a fraction, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. One of the seats, a rusty bucket on the edge, creaked forward and backward like it was testing the air. And then, a child's giggle rang out. It was high-pitched and sweet, but it wasn't human. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back to my friends. "We need to leave now," I said, grabbing Mark by the arm, but he didn't move. He was staring at the clown stage where a small, shadowy figure stood. It had the shape of a child, but its limbs were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Another giggle, closer this time. I pulled Mark again, but he yanked his arm free and stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. The figure on the stage came to life. It moved with the jerky, stuttering motion of a marionette, limbs twitching in a dance that felt both mechanical and alive. It was dressed in a faded clown suit, with patches that looked like they had been stitched with coarse, black thread. Its face was painted in a grotesque grin, eyes hollow and unblinking. "Get out," I screamed, grabbing Lisa and dragging her toward the exit. We ran past the bumper cars, the wind roaring behind us as the distant sound of a carnival organ started up, playing a broken, discordant tune. As we reached the gate, the childish giggle cut through the air again, louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder one last time and saw a pale hand, fingers too long and tipped with dark nails, reaching out from the edge of the Ferris wheel seat. The night air felt sharp as we bolted through the gate, the iron bars clanging shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we were far from the park, the sounds of the organ still ringing in our ears. None of us spoke on the way home. When we looked at each other, we knew we had seen a glimpse of something that shouldn't be. A reminder that some places hold more than just memories. They hold echoes of things that should have been forgotten. And the park, with its twisted laughter and stilled rides, was far from abandoned. It was waiting. The first time I saw the lights, I thought it was just my imagination. My friends and I were out on a camping trip, deep in a forest that stretched for miles in every direction. We'd set up our tents near an old, dry creek bed, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of rustling leaves. It was supposed to be a weekend of nothing but stargazing and good company. But that first night, as the fire crackled and we laughed at silly stories, I noticed the lights. At first, they were small flickers, like fireflies, darting between the trees in the distance. I pointed them out to my friends, but they shrugged it off as some trick of the light. I wasn't convinced. The lights moved too erratically, too deliberately. I could feel my pulse quicken as I watched them dance in the dark, weaving between the trunks like something searching for prey. By the second night, the lights had grown brighter, more constant. They were no longer tiny sparks, they were glowing orbs, weaving and twisting in a pattern I couldn't decipher. They came closer now, stopping just at the edge of the clearing. I wanted to tell my friends, but when I glanced at them, their faces were pale, eyes wide as they looked past me. I turned back, heart thudding in my chest, and found myself staring at a figure just beyond the fire's glow. It was hard to make out in the shifting darkness, but it was tall, almost unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and two eyes as bright as the orbs looked directly at me. They were the only thing visible on its dark form, twin headlights piercing the night. A sickening silence fell over the group. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, louder than ever in the void that seemed to have swallowed everything else. My friend, Jonah, reached for his flashlight, but before he could switch it on, the figure moved, fast and fluid, disappearing into the woods. I wanted to call out, to ask what we should do, but my voice was caught in my throat. The lights followed the figure, blinking and weaving through the trees as if they were alive, guiding it deeper into the forest. We didn't speak, couldn't. The realization that whatever we had seen was not human had settled in our bones, cold and terrifying. We packed up the tents and backpacks without a word, barely glancing at each other as we stumbled toward the path out. The night air felt different now, heavy with a static charge that made my skin prickle. The lights were still there, moving behind us, their glow growing more intense. As if they were gaining on us. The forest felt like a maze, a living, breathing thing with walls that shifted as we ran. I glanced back one last time, and in that moment, I understood what the lights were. They weren't guiding the figure. They were it. It had no form without them, no shape without the glow that surrounded it. The lights didn't just move, they hunted. We made it to the edge of the forest just before dawn, stumbling out onto the gravel road. The lights blinked and flared behind us, but they didn't come out of the woods. They paused, their glow fading slowly, like the last breath of a dying star. Then they were gone. It wasn't until later, when we recounted the night to others, that we learned the truth. The locals spoke in hushed voices about the lights of the forest. They called them the wanderers, an ancient presence that moved with the dark, searching for those who dared to stay past the sun. The experience changed us, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the nightmares that came after. Dreams of those eyes, that terrible, impossible figure that had no face and no voice, only the light that came and went, always searching. And I realized the last thing I saw before I left that forest wasn't the lights. It was a single, dark shape standing at the edge, watching, waiting for the next night. I didn't expect the quiet to be so loud. The wind had stopped, and the moonlight cast long, distorted shadows across the deserted parking lot of the old amusement park. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, still and broken, like a giant skeleton. It had been years since anyone had come here, but I'd wanted to see it one last time. The place had been the highlight of my childhood, a backdrop for days spent laughing and riding the roller coasters until we were dizzy. I hadn't realized just how eerie it would feel to stand there alone, to be surrounded by the crumbling reminders of happier days. My shoes crunched over the gravel as I made my way toward the carousel. It was wrapped in rust and shadow. The painted horses froze in mid-gallop, their eyes cracked and hollow. I thought I heard something. A whisper, barely louder than the wind that was now just a memory. My heart picked up speed, but I told myself it was the sound of my own nerves. I wasn't alone, though. I knew it, deep down in my gut. I wasn't the only one there. I turned to leave, the uneasy sensation pressing at the back of my neck. But then I heard a laughter that rang out, bright and childlike, from the direction of the fun house. My breath caught in my throat. No one had been there when I arrived. I would have seen them. The fun house had been sealed shut, its doors warped and peeling like cold skin. The laughter came again, louder this time, and then a second sound joined it, a deep, grating laugh that didn't belong to any child. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward, past the ticket booths and past the warped remnants of the bumper cars. Each step was a battle, and when I reached the entrance to the fun house, I hesitated. The glass panels were cracked and warped, reflecting my pale, wide-eyed face back at me. The laughter stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I knew I should run. I knew I should get out of there and never come back. But I was frozen, and then the door creaked open on its own, as if inviting me in. I stepped inside, and the air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of mold and something sharp I couldn't place. The sound of my breath echoed in the empty halls, and the lights overhead flickered to life, casting jagged shadows that danced like living things. I took a shaky step forward, and then another. My fingers brushed against the peeling wallpaper, and I shuddered. There were mirrors everywhere, warped and cracked. They made me look like I was bending and breaking, and in some, I saw reflections of people I knew I hadn't brought with me. A girl with dark hair and wide, staring eyes. A man with hollow cheeks and a grin too wide to be human. I spun around, searching for the exit, but I couldn't remember how I'd gotten in. My pulse quickened as I heard the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, behind me. The sound echoed in the mirrored hallways, and I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving just out of reach. I whipped around, heart slamming against my ribcage, but there was nothing. Just my reflection, looking back with a smile that wasn't mine. The laughter came again, close this time, and I screamed. I ran, blindly, the world around me a whirl of broken glass and cracked laughter. I stumbled and fell, scraping my palms against the cold tile, and when I looked up, the hallway was no longer empty. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, with eyes that glistened like wet stones and smiles that stretched impossibly wide. The last thing I saw before I turned and bolted was my own reflection in the cracked mirror. It wasn't a mirror anymore. It was a face, pale and twisted, reaching out for me with fingers that passed through the glass and grabbed my arm. I never stopped running. I burst out of the fun house and into the cold, empty night, gasping for air. The laughter still echoed behind me, but when I dared to look back, the fun house was gone. Just an empty patch of ground, a dark hole in the earth. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know this: when I left that night, I wasn't alone, and whatever it was, it followed me home. The sun had barely set when we drove into the winding, narrow roads leading to the lake. My friends and I were headed out for an evening of fishing, a break from the city's noise and suffocating lights. The lake, bordered by tall trees and surrounded by nothing but silence, was the perfect escape. It felt like stepping back in time, to a place where people didn't exist except for us. We parked the old van by the shore, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and got out to stretch. The smell of the lake hit me first, fresh, earthy, mixed with a hint of moss. It was peaceful, serene, almost too quiet. We set up our gear and started fishing, the water lapping gently against the dock. Conversation was light, punctuated by the occasional splash of a fish or a distant hoot of an owl. I leaned back, letting the breeze ruffle my hair, when I heard something else, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the woods behind us. I glanced at the others, but they seemed oblivious, engrossed in their own lines. "Anyone else hear that?" I asked, forcing a laugh to mask the tremor in my voice. "Probably just an animal," Mark replied, barely looking up. I wasn't so sure. The thumping grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make. It was too regular, like footsteps or something dragging across the forest floor. I shifted in my seat, eyes darting toward the trees where the fading light couldn't reach. I heard a rustling and stiffened. A branch snapped, followed by a low, guttural sound. My friends, still unbothered, chatted about the fish they hoped to catch, but I couldn't focus. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stayed rooted to the dock, staring into the darkness. The air grew colder, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that made me gag. That was when I saw a flash of movement, too fast for my eyes to catch. The thumping stopped. There was silence, a silence so complete it pressed against my ears. "Hey, you guys okay?" I asked, finally getting the courage to break the tension. "Fine," said Mia, casting her line again, but I saw her glance nervously at the forest behind us. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the tree line, limping forward with an uneven gait. It was tall, too tall, with long arms that hung almost to the ground. Its skin was pale, mottled, with dark veins that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Its face was gaunt, eyes hollow, mouth twisted into a grimace that looked more like a snarl. Before I could shout or run, it let out a sound that made the air crackle, a mix between a human scream and the screech of a bird. We scrambled to our feet, stumbling over our fishing gear as we tried to make sense of what we were seeing. "Run!" Mark shouted, and we bolted, sprinting toward the van, the sound of uneven feet pounding behind us. We didn't look back. We didn't dare. I reached the van first, yanking open the door as Mia and Mark threw themselves in. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out, the headlights illuminating the woods in wild, frantic sweeps. The figure stood there, watching us, unmoving, but I could feel its eyes boring into me even as we drove away. We didn't stop until we were back in the city, the noise of traffic and the glow of streetlights making it feel like a different world. We didn't speak as we sat in the van, the quiet pressing down on us like a weight. And then came the knock at the window. We froze, heartbeats thundering. Outside, standing just beyond the safety of the glass, was the figure from the woods. Its face was now pressed against the window, mouth open as if to scream, but instead, it made that same guttural, bird-like noise. Mark couldn't take it. He jammed the car into gear, tires screeching as we pulled away. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was still there, watching us, its eyes wide and hollow, as if waiting for us to return. It never followed us home, but I swore I heard that same rhythmic thumping as I lay in bed that night, and I knew it was waiting for me, somewhere in the dark, waiting to come back. It started as a simple trip to the local amusement park. A few friends and I were looking for something fun to do on a Friday night, and the park was just the kind of place where we could let loose and forget about everything. It was an old park, the kind that hadn't seen major renovations in years, but it had a charm to it: trusty rides, creaky old attractions, and that faint scent of popcorn and oil that lingered in the air. We spent the first hour riding the Ferris wheel and playing games, laughing as we tried to win the giant stuffed animals. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. The bright lights seemed to flicker more often, and the music that once filled the air now felt jarring, like it was being played through an old, broken speaker. It was around 10 p.m. when we stumbled upon the House of Mirrors, a dark labyrinth and maze that looked like something out of an old horror movie. A sign above the entrance read, "Enter if you dare." We laughed and dared each other to go inside, half joking about how cheesy it would be. The inside was a maze of mirrors, each one reflecting our movements back at us in a way that made us feel trapped. We wandered, calling out to each other and laughing when we accidentally bumped into the mirrored walls. But the deeper we went, the quieter we became. The laughter turned into an easy silence, and we kept glancing at our reflections, wondering if we were being watched. "Hey, where's Emma?" I asked, looking around. She had been right behind me a moment ago. The silence stretched, and I felt a cold prick of fear. I called her name, but there was no response. "Emma," I repeated, more urgently now. A shiver ran down my spine as I took a few steps deeper into the maze, my eyes darting from one reflection to the next, searching for her. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound behind me, a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs, but the mirrors only reflected my wide-eyed face, staring back at me in confusion. I took a few steps toward where I thought the sound came from. The air grew colder, and the dim lights above flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the glass. And then I saw a shadow that didn't belong to any of us. It was thin and hunched, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. It was watching me from a corner, its eyes hollow and dark, reflecting the dim light in a way that made them seem alive. I backed away, my mind racing. "Emma, is that you?" I whispered, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilting ever so slightly as if trying to understand me. The sound of footsteps came again, this time closer, and I realized with a sick jolt that the shadow was following me, its movements jerky and out of sync with the way a human would move. Panic set in as I turned and ran, the maze of mirrors warping my sense of direction. I called out for my friends, the echo of my voice bouncing back at me like some cruel joke. The shadow followed, always a step behind, its ragged form reflected in the mirrors around me. I caught glimpses of its arms that seemed to stretch too long, a face that seemed almost familiar, but twisted, as if made from shattered glass. I finally stumbled out into the open air, gasping and shaking, and saw my friends huddled near the entrance, staring in confusion. Emma was among them, eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to me. I turned back to look at the entrance of the House of Mirrors, expecting to see that shadow staring at me from inside. But the entrance was empty, the lights flickering as if nothing had happened. I wanted to tell them what I saw, but when I looked into the glass walls of the house, all I could see was my own reflection, staring back at me with eyes that were no longer mine. They were hollow and dark. The moon was full, casting silver light across the desert as I drove along the empty road, the sound of gravel crunching under my tires. My friend Leo and I were heading to a remote, old roadside diner we'd heard about, a place that only opened once a year during the full moon. The legend said it was where lost travelers found their way, and we were adventurous enough to take that challenge. As we approached, I noticed the diner was nothing like I'd expected. It was an old, beat-up building with cracked glass windows and peeling paint. The neon sign that said Mabel's flickered sporadically, barely holding onto its promise of warm meals and forgotten stories. But we were here, and I wanted to see it through. Leo parked the car, and we stepped out, the chill of the desert night making my skin prickle. We pushed open the door, and the air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The place was dimly lit by oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows across the cracked tile floor. A jukebox sat in the corner, but it was silent. "Feels like we're in a movie," Leo whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and unease. The only person inside was an elderly woman at the counter, her back turned as she adjusted a pot on the stove. Her hair was silver, and she wore a faded apron. She turned slowly, a smile spreading across her face as she took us in. "Welcome, travelers. You've come at just the right time," she said. Her voice like gravel, but warm. We exchanged nervous glances before taking a seat by the window. The waitress sat down to menus and left without saying a word, moving like a shadow. The stillness was broken when the door creaked open behind us. I turned and my breath caught in my throat. A man stepped inside, his skin pale as bone, eyes sunken and black. He didn't look at us. He walked straight to the booth at the far end of the diner, where he sat with a hunched posture. I looked away, shaking my head, but I couldn't escape the feeling that he was staring at me, eyes burning through my back. Leo's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "You see that guy? He doesn't look right." Before I could answer, the waitress returned, setting 2 plates of steaming food in front of us. "Eat up, boys. The night won't last long," she said, her eyes glancing at the man in the booth. I took a bite, trying not to think about the man. The food was warm, comfortingly spiced, but there was an underlying taste that I couldn't place, something metallic, almost bitter. Leo's eyes widened as he looked past me, and I turned to see the man at the booth standing up, moving toward us. He stopped beside our table, leaning down so his face was mere inches from mine. "Leave," he rasped. His voice was deeper than I expected, like it came from somewhere far beneath the earth. "Before it's too late." I couldn't move. My chest tightened, my mouth dry as I stared into those dark, hollow eyes. The waitress came over, her face pinched as if she were trying to keep something back. "Enough, Edward," she said, her voice low but firm. The man shrank back, glancing at her with a look of both fear and longing. Leo swallowed hard and pushed his chair back, knocking it over in his rush. I stood too, but as we made to leave, the room went dark. The lamps flickered and died, leaving us in an eerie, suffocating silence. Then, the jukebox clicked to life, playing a song I didn't recognize, a slow, mournful tune with a deep, almost mournful voice singing about betrayal and loss, and then the whispers started. First, they were faint, like the wind through the cracks, but they grew louder, insistent, filling the room. "Leave, it's not safe." The man Edward was now behind the counter, his head lowered, fingers pressing against his temples. The waitress stood between us and the door, blocking our escape. "You shouldn't have come," she said, the warmth in her voice replaced by something cold and sharp. Leo grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back door, the only exit that wasn't blocked. I barely managed to reach it when the whispers turned into a screech. The sound was so piercing it felt like my eardrums were about to burst. As we dashed outside into the moonlight, I glanced back one last time. The diner was now empty, the flickering neon sign blinking out. The whispers followed us into the desert night, and I knew we hadn't escaped. Not really. The next morning, when we returned to find the diner, there was no trace of it, just an empty stretch of desert, like it had never been there at all. And deep in my mind, I could still hear those whispers. It was the first day of summer, and I was looking forward to some downtime. My friends and I had planned to head out to the old amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been closed for years, ever since the accident that left half the rides twisted and rusting, but rumors swirled about it being haunted. That only made it more exciting. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as we approached the entrance, a battered iron gate that stood crooked and barely held together. We pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. It was strange. The place was eerily silent. No creaks of metal, no whispers of the wine, just the silence of a forgotten place. We walked down the cracked pavement, passing the toppled Ferris wheel that loomed like a skeleton against the orange sky. The ticket booth, now shattered and covered in ivy, looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I could almost picture the cheerful voices and laughter from years ago, now swallowed by the emptiness. "Let's check out the fun house," my friend Alex suggested, breaking the uneasy quiet. It was a tall building with peeling paint and broken mirrors that reflected more shadows than light. The entrance was flanked by 2 grinning clowns, their painted smiles chipped and faded. I felt a chill run down my spine as we stepped inside. The air smelled of damp and rust, and each creak of the wooden floorboards felt louder than it should. The hall twisted and turned in a dizzying labyrinth, walls covered with warped, cracked mirrors that distorted our reflections. Suddenly, I heard something. It was faint, but unmistakable, a soft, childlike giggle coming from the darkness. I froze and glanced at the others. Sam, the most skeptical of the group, gave a nervous chuckle. "Probably just the wind," he said, but there was a tremor in his voice. We pressed on, the giggles growing louder, almost as if they were following us. One of the mirrors cracked as Alex brushed past it, and the sudden noise made me jump. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hall behind us was empty. "Let's get out of here," I said, but as we turned to leave, the entrance was gone. The hallway had shifted, leading us deeper into the maze. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a steady, thudding beat of panic. The laughter came again, and this time, it was louder. It echoed around us, reverberating off the mirrors and walls, until it became a chorus of voices that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "Stop this," Sam said, his voice shaking. He reached out to touch the nearest mirror, and I could have sworn I saw a hand reaching back through it. It was pale, small, and covered in smudged, red paint that looked like blood. Before we could react, a child's voice whispered from the other side of the hallway. "Play with me." The air grew colder. I could see our breath, pale and foggy, swirling around us as if we were outside in the dead of winter. I grabbed Alex's arm, my eyes wide with fear. The mirrors reflected not just our scared faces, but dozens of small figures, their wide, empty eyes staring back at us, mouths stretched into cruel smiles. "Run," I managed to say, and we bolted. The hallway seemed to twist and shift, our footsteps echoing as we scrambled for an exit that kept moving just out of reach. Behind us, the laughter grew, a cacophony that turned to shrieks, small hands reaching out from the walls as if the building itself was trying to swallow us whole. We burst into the open air, gasping and trembling. The amusement park was quiet again, the dark now pressing around us. I dared a glance over my shoulder, and for a moment, I swore I saw a small figure at the entrance of the fun house, standing still, watching. It was a child, pale and hollow-eyed, its smile far too wide. "Let's get out of here," I said, and we ran, not daring to look back. The next morning, the news reported an inexplicable blackout at the old amusement park. They found the front gate smashed and the fun house completely empty. But as I sat in my room later, that day, I noticed something in the reflection of my mirror, small, pale fingers pressing against the glass, and a voice that whispered, "You didn't play with me." It started as an innocent idea. My friends and I were looking for something to do one evening, and when Mark suggested we explore the abandoned amusement park, just outside of town, it seemed like the perfect adventure. We were young, reckless, and eager for a thrill, unaware that the park had a reputation. The sun was just beginning to set as we approached the rusted gates, which hung crooked and creaked in the wind. The faded, peeling sign read "Wonderland of Wonders" in letters that had almost been swallowed by time. We stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of metal and the faint, sharp tang of rust. The place was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant screech of a crow. We walked past the ticket booth, its glass pane shattered and dark, and made our way to the old Ferris wheel. It loomed above us, a skeletal giant. The paint was chipped and flaking, and the seats were bent and warped, some hanging at odd angles. We dared each other to climb up into the rusted cars and take photos. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture as Sam posed dramatically, making a face. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a stick tapping on metal. At first, I thought it was just a rodent, but then it came again, closer this time. I glanced at Mark, who was staring at the carousel. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their eyes wide and hollow, as if they had seen something that terrified them. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a breath. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the jovial air now replaced with tension. We started walking toward the carousel when the tapping sound came again, this time from behind us. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the place was empty. Just the broken down rides, the scattered debris, and the wind that seemed to have picked up speed. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, glancing nervously at the way we had come. "No," "Let's check out the fun house," Sam said, his voice cracking. He tried to sound brave, but it came out hollow. We hesitated, but curiosity won out, and we made our way toward the warped fun house at the center of the park. The entrance was a gaping mouth, the teeth jagged and chipped. The darkness inside seemed to beckon us. We stepped inside, and the air grew colder, the smell of damp and decay stronger. The floor creaked as we moved through, and suddenly the sounds started up again, tapping, like fingernails on glass. I shivered, but before I could say anything, Sam screamed. We rushed to him, finding him backed up against a mirror, staring at his reflection. But it wasn't just his reflection, it was a face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at him with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It moved, just slightly, tilting its head like it was studying him. He stumbled away, pushing past us, and we bolted out of the funhouse, gasping for breath. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the silence was deafening. We didn't speak, just ran back to the entrance, but as I glanced behind me, I saw hundreds of reflections in the shattered mirrors of the funhouse, all faces that were watching us, grinning, unmoving. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping and shaking, looking back to see the amusement park shrouded in darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the broken rides. To this day, we never speak of what happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft tapping sound, like nails on glass, and I know that somewhere, in the dark, a reflection is waiting for me to look. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon as I walked back from the market, the light splintering through the trees and casting long, jagged shadows on the gravel path. I had spent the day on the farm, helping out with chores and picking up supplies. The farm belonged to an old couple who lived at the far end of the property, and I had agreed to run their errands while they rested. The path I was on led through a dense section of woods, a shortcut that shaved off nearly half a mile. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their leaves like dark, jagged teeth against the deepening sky. The woods were never truly silent, but tonight there was something else, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the direction of the clearing. I paused, my fingers tightening around the handle of my basket. The thumping continued, steady and deep, like the sound of something heavy being struck over and over. I took a breath, telling myself it was probably just the wind moving the branches. But the air felt thick and close, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My footfalls quickened as I pressed on, each step sounding louder in the stillness. The path narrowed, the woods seeming to lean in around me like watchful eyes. I glanced behind me, heart skipping a beat as I caught sight of something at the edge of the woods, a figure standing just beyond the trees, hidden in the deepening shadows. The thumping sound grew louder now, closer, as if whatever was making it was moving along the path toward me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my basket as a sharp, bone-chilling scream split the air. It was human but distorted, like it had been pulled through a funnel of raw static. My blood froze in my veins. I turned and sprinted, feet pounding on the gravel as I pushed through the brambles and thorns that clawed at my skin. The scream sounded again, closer, louder, until it was a banshee wail echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back, focusing instead on the pale glow of the farm's porch light ahead. My breath was ragged by the time I reached the clearing. The porch light blinked on, its yellow hue casting an eerie glow across the yard. I ran up to the front door and hammered on it, eyes darting to the woods behind me, expecting to see something emerge. The sound of the thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep silence that seemed almost deafening. The door creaked open, and the old man peered out, eyes wide with concern. I tried to catch my breath, but the words caught in my throat. He put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me inside, away from the oppressive night. "Are you all right, dear?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. I wanted to tell him what I'd heard, what I'd seen, but my voice had turned to ashes. Just then, there was a knock at the back door, sharp and urgent. We both turned to look at it, the old man's face draining of color. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no response, just a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A cold, clammy hand touched my arm from behind, and I spun around, my vision blurring with tears of panic. But there was nothing there. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whatever was at the door was pushing against it, testing its strength. The old man reached for the key hanging by the door, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. I glanced out the small window by the door and caught sight of a figure in the moonlight, too far to make out clearly, but the eyes cold and unblinking stared straight at me. The scream came again, not from the woods, but from right outside the door, the sound making my ears feel like they were going to split open. The old man's hands trembled as he unlocked the door, and I knew then that whatever was out there wasn't something that could be kept out. The door swung open, revealing nothing but night, and in that silence, a voice rasped, barely audible, "Let me in." It wasn't the old man's voice. It wasn't human. I backed away, clutching the basket to my chest as the light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The scream, now a whisper, seemed to seep through the walls as the door slammed shut behind me. The knocking stopped. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect and unwind. My friends and I were overdue for a weekend getaway. So, when we found a secluded cabin in the woods, we jumped at the opportunity. We arrived late Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was exactly what we'd hoped for: old, rustic, and off the beaten path. There was something charming about the creaky floors and the smell of pine in the air. We gathered around the fireplace, laughing and reminiscing, settling in for what promised to be a peaceful weekend. But that first night, something felt off. As the fire crackled, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with a strange rhythm. It wasn't the kind of wind that howls, it was like something was tapping on the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just branches brushing against the wood. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, like a soft tap on the front door. I glanced at my friends, but no one seemed to notice. The knock came again, this time louder, followed by a low scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy along the floor. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't just the wind. The knocking had a deliberate, almost human quality to it. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one responded immediately. So I stood up and walked to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I heard nothing but the wind outside, howling against the trees. I slowly backed away, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The night passed in a strange haze. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, hearing the occasional knock on the door and the unsettling scraping sound. But when I checked again, no one was outside. The cabin was still. The next morning, I brushed it off. It had been a long drive, and we were all exhausted, but when we stepped outside to explore the woods, I noticed something strange: footprints in the snow leading toward the cabin, fresh and deep. They weren't from any of us. They circled the cabin before fading into the trees. I didn't say anything at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods felt too quiet, like the trees were watching us, waiting. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the outdoors, but that night, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just beyond the window. I quietly got up, careful not to wake the others, and peeked outside. Nothing, just the snow-covered ground and the trees, swaying in the wind. But then I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It didn't seem to belong to anything. The figure moved with unnatural grace, its silhouette stretching across the snow. I stared for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but when I blinked, it was gone. I bolted back to my bed, my heart racing. I lay there, wide awake, listening, and then I heard the knock. Soft at first, then harder, followed by a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was ragged, almost distorted. I didn't know who it was or what it wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I stayed still, too terrified to move, listening as the knocking came again, louder this time, right against the door. It didn't stop. Not until morning. The next day, I told my friends about what happened. They thought I was just spooked, maybe imagining things, but they agreed to leave early. As we packed up the car, I noticed something else. The footprints from the day before weren't just around the cabin, they were leading toward the woods, and they were fresh, but they didn't look like human footprints. They were too large, too deep, and there was something wrong about them. They circled around the cabin, but then, right by the door, there were more marks. Scratches, gouges in the wood, like something had been clawing at it from the outside. We didn't wait around to investigate. We left, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The trees surrounding it were unnaturally still, the wind completely absent. We never went back, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us. Something that had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that wanted in. What I didn't realize until later was that the knocking wasn't the scariest part. It was the voice, the one that whispered, "Let me in." Because when I went back through the photos we took that weekend, I noticed something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, just outside the window, there's a figure standing in the trees, and it's smiling. Cabin in the woods, just me and a few friends. No distractions, no work, just nature. We had rented the place online, a secluded spot far from civilization. None of us were particularly into ghost stories. So when we arrived and saw how isolated the cabin was, it felt more peaceful than eerie. The cabin itself was charming, if a bit old. The walls creaked in places, but we didn't think much of it. The first night, after a few drinks and some laughter, we headed to bed, but sleep didn't come easily for me. The room was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind howling outside, and then scratch a faint noise from the other side of the cabin. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe an animal outside, but when the scratching sound continued, it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I waited for my friends to make a joke about it. When no one did, I decided to get up and check. I crept down the hallway toward the front door, peering through the window at the darkness outside. Nothing. No movement, just trees swaying under the moonlight. I sighed in relief and turned to head back to my room. That's when I heard a soft, desperate knock on the door. Knock. Knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially in such a remote place? I moved slowly back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I stood there, straining my ears for any sounds. There was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. I finally returned to my room, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I locked the door behind me, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, hoping they would laugh it off. But no one did. Instead, Sarah, one of the girls with us, said she heard something too. She described the same scratching sound I'd heard, but from the window. She had thought it was an animal at first, but the knocking she couldn't explain. We spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to clear our heads. It felt like the cabin was miles away from any other human being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. That night, after dinner, we were all sitting around the fireplace, and the conversation turned toward local legends. Apparently, the area was known for being haunted, or so the locals claimed. One of my friends, Jake, started telling a story about a woman who had gone missing years ago, her last known location being just a few miles from the cabin. He described how people said they could hear her crying at night. I laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare me. Later that night, when we were all in our rooms, I heard the sound again, the unmistakable scratch on the wood. And then, once again, the knock. But this time, it wasn't on the door. It was on my window. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain back, heart racing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I closed the curtains quickly, then heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. "Let me in." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. I glanced toward the door. Still locked. My room felt suffocating. The knock came again. Bang. Louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room, down the hall to the living room, and yanked open the door. Nothing. No one was outside. Just the pitch-black darkness of the woods. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I stood there, staring out into the void. I closed the door, leaning against it, trying to calm myself. And then, in the faint light of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob was wet. A trail of dark smudges marked the wooden floor. leading from the door to the window of the living room. I followed the trail, every step feeling like it was pulling me into some kind of nightmare. I reached the window. There, smeared against the glass, was a handprint, and it wasn't small. It was large for a person. I backed away in terror, stumbling toward the door. But when I looked out into the woods again, I saw something. A figure, standing in the distance, just outside the boundary of the trees. It was watching us. It was always watching. I slammed the door shut and rushed to wake the others. But when I turned to tell them, they were all standing in the hallway, staring at me in silence. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until I looked down that I realized the handprint wasn't on the window. It was on the back of my hand, and it was still wet. We packed up and left at once, leaving the cabin behind. But every time I close my eyes, I still see that figure in the distance. And the worst part, I know it followed us. We never should have left. Working as a park ranger can be peaceful. The endless expanse of forest, the fresh air, and the solitude make it feel like you're part of something ancient. But there are nights I wish I could forget. Nights like the one I'm about to tell you. It started with a routine call late in the evening. A camper reported strange noises near the eastern edge of the park, deep in the woods. Normally, I'd write it off as wildlife. Foxes or coyotes can make sounds that send chills down your spine. But the urgency in his voice made me take it seriously. He said he'd seen someone or something lurking near his tent. He refused to stay the night. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and the keys to the Jeep, and set out toward the eastern trail. The park was vast, and the trails were isolated. It would take me about an hour to reach the site. The drive was uneventful, but as I got closer, I noticed the forest felt unusually still. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I found the campsite easily enough. The camper was gone, his gear hastily packed up, but nothing seemed out of place. I radioed back to the station to let them know I'd arrived and began walking the perimeter, looking for tracks or signs of an animal. That's when I saw them footprints. Human, but wrong. The prints were elongated, the toes splayed out in a way that didn't look natural. They led away from the site and into the woods. My instincts told me to turn back, but protocol was protocol. I had to investigate. I followed the trail, shining my flashlight ahead. The beam illuminated the twisted branches and the uneven terrain, but nothing else. The prints continued deeper into the forest, eventually veering toward a dense thicket. I hesitated. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, pushing through the brush. I came across something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt was an old, rusted lantern, the glass shattered. It looked decades old, far too weathered to have belonged to the camper. Nearby, the footprints stopped abruptly, no sign of where they led, no indication of a struggle, just silence. A faint noise broke the stillness, a low, guttural moan. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the trees. My breath quickened, and I gripped the light tighter. The moan came again, louder this time, followed by a snapping sound, like a branch breaking under heavy weight. My radio crackled to life, startling me. It was static at first, but then I heard a voice, faint and distorted. It wasn't one of my co-workers. The voice repeated the same phrase, over and over. Get out now. Get out now. My blood ran cold. I spun around, shining the light in every direction, but there was nothing, only the towering trees and the oppressive darkness. The radio fell silent again. I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was out here wasn't something I could handle alone. I turned to head back to the Jeep, but as I stepped out of the thicket, I froze. Standing in the path, just outside the reach of my flashlight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. My heart pounded as I slowly backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hands. The beam flickered, and for a moment, the figure disappeared. When the light steadied, it was closer. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, but I managed to stay upright. The figure didn't advance any further. It simply stood there, its head tilted slightly, as if observing me. The air felt electric, charged with something I couldn't explain. I didn't wait. I ran. the flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back to the campsite. When I reached the Jeep, I threw myself inside, locking the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine. I didn't look back. The next morning, I returned with the team. The campsite was empty, just as I'd left it. But when we reached the thicket, there was no sign of the footprints, no lantern, no figure. It was as if none of it had happened. My coworkers thought I'd imagined it, that maybe exhaustion had gotten the better of me. But I know what I saw. A week later, I found something tucked under the seat of my Jeep. An old, rusted lantern, the glass shattered, just like the one in the woods. I keep it locked in a cabinet at the station. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint moan coming from inside. I try not to think about what it means. We'd been hiking all day, the weight of our packs growing heavier with each mile. Our goal was to reach a remote part of the forest where we could set up camp away from all signs of civilization. By the time we found a clearing to set up for the night, the sky had begun to darken. We quickly built a fire, spreading out our sleeping bags and gathering around to eat. The trees stood tall and dense around us, casting long, twisting shadows that danced with the firelight. It was so quiet that even the smallest rustle seemed loud, the forest pressing in on us from all sides. As the night wore on, our laughter and conversation faded, replaced by the quiet sounds of crackling wood and occasional night birds. It was peaceful, at least at first. Then we began to hear a distant noise, a slow, dragging sound like something being pulled through the underbrush. We all went silent, staring into the darkness, but the noise quickly stopped. Probably an animal, I thought, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to brush it off, we resumed talking, but every so often, we heard it again, a dragging, shuffling sound, inching closer each time. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing, just empty woods stretching into darkness. We told ourselves it was a deer, or maybe some fallen branches shifting in the wind, but then we heard something new, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from deep in the woods. It was faint at first, like the sound of a branch hitting a tree, but it was too steady, too deliberate. We listened, each of us trying to figure out where it was coming from, but the tapping seemed to circle us, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern around the clearing. My friend suggested we head to bed, so we each retreated to our tents, trying to ignore the unsettling sounds. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding. Just as I was starting to calm down, I heard footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves. They stopped just outside, and I held my breath, not daring to move. Then came a scratching sound along the outside of my tent, as if fingers were dragging across the fabric. I stayed frozen, listening, hoping it would stop. Then came a whisper, low and gravelly, barely audible. "Let me in." My heart stopped. The whisper was right outside my tent, close enough that I could feel the breath through the thin fabric. The footsteps started up again, shuffling away from my tent and toward my friends. I could hear them stop. Then the same scratching, the same chilling whisper, soft but distinct. "Let me in." I wanted to yell out, to warn him, but my voice caught in my throat. The footsteps moved to the next tent, the scratching and whispering starting again. One by one, it went to each of our tents, as though it was trying to pick us off, one by one. Then silence. I lay still, straining to hear, hoping it was over. Suddenly, there was a loud crash right outside my tent. Something heavy slammed into the ground, and the whole tent shook. I clutched my flashlight, barely breathing. Then came a dragging sound, as though something was being pulled right past my tent. It was close, too close, just inches away from where I lay. In the silence that followed, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent just a fraction, shining my flashlight into the clearing. I nearly screamed. Lying in the middle of our campsite was an old, tattered doll, its face cracked and smeared with dirt, one eye missing. The doll's head was tilted at an odd angle, staring directly at my tent. We all scrambled out of our tents, each of us staring at the doll in shock, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It hadn't been there when we set up camp, and none of us had brought it. My friend grabbed a stick and poked it, but it didn't move. He kicked it toward the edge of the clearing, and we all stood in tense silence, waiting to see if anything happened. We decided to put out the fire and move our camp a bit farther down the trail, away from whatever had left that doll in our clearing. We packed quickly, our flashlights casting wild shadows as we made our way through the trees. The silence was thick, broken only by our hurried footsteps, but just as we reached a spot that felt safe, I glanced back down the trail. There, at the edge of the firelight, was the doll. It was standing upright, leaning against a tree, facing us directly. Its remaining eye gleamed in the darkness, watching as we froze in horror. And then it moved. The doll raised one arm, reaching out toward us, and that gravelly voice filled the night air again, but louder this time, more urgent. Come back. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We ran, stumbling through the underbrush, not stopping until we reached the road. None of us ever spoke about that night again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in my room, I can still hear that whisper, "Let me in." The camping trip started as a way to escape the chaos of city life. My friends and I set off into the wilderness, our spirits high and supplies packed. We found a secluded spot near a lake, surrounded by towering trees. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, laughter echoing through the woods. Yena had brought a deck of cards, and we played games until the stars blanketed the sky. Once the games faded into silence, Matt suggested a night hike. Yena looked hesitant, but was quickly swept up in the excitement. I had always loved the woods, so I was all in. As we made our way down a narrow path, the moonlight filtered through the trees, creating an ethereal glow. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature surrounded us. But then we heard something, a faint rustling, that made me stop in my tracks. I brushed it off as the wind and continued walking, though an unsettling feeling settled in my stomach. We pressed on, deeper into the woods, but the sense of unease lingered. Just when I thought we'd enjoy a peaceful walk, a loud snap echoed in the stillness. It sounded like a branch breaking, but the sound was too close for comfort. Gina's eyes widened, and she whispered that we should go back. But before we could turn around, we caught sight of something moving in the distance. A figure was partially illuminated by the moonlight, standing still among the trees. It looked human, but was too far away to see clearly. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. But the moment I did, the figure suddenly darted behind a tree. It was quick and too agile for comfort. My instincts screamed to get back to camp, but curiosity got the better of me. I urged my friends to follow, and we moved cautiously toward the area where we'd seen the figure. As we got closer, the air felt heavier, almost electric. I shone my flashlight around, but the woods seemed to swallow the light. The figure was gone. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and the laughter we shared earlier faded into a tense silence. Just then, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sent chills up my spine. "Help me." We froze, hearts pounding, searching for the source of the voice. It sounded desperate and distant, echoing through the trees. Yena gripped my arm tightly, and we all turned in unison toward the sound, which seemed to draw us deeper into the woods. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. "Help me." Compelled by a mix of fear and concern, I led the group further into the darkness, following the voice that begged for help. As we walked, the whispering intensified, morphing into frantic cries. The air grew colder, and shadows danced menacingly around us. Suddenly, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit old cabin, the kind you only see in horror movies. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar. The cries for help echoed from inside, now sounding almost pleading. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I couldn't turn back. We had to see what was going on. We approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking under our feet as we stepped inside. The air was stale, and the smell of decay filled the space. The cries for help were now frantic, almost desperate. I felt a pull, as if something was urging me to go deeper into the cabin. My friends hung back, uncertainty etched on their faces. Then, as I turned to look into one of the dark rooms, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart raced, and I whirled around, panic rising. The cries turned into laughter, echoing around me. It was a sinister, mocking sound that sent waves of dread through my body. I pounded on the door, yelling for my friends. The door creaked open, and I stumbled back into the clearing, breathless. My friends stood there, eyes wide with fear. They hadn't heard any cries, They hadn't heard anything. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the area. I felt my stomach drop as realization hit. We had followed a voice that wasn't there, led into a trap we could barely comprehend. We turned to run back to camp, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. We didn't stop until we reached the lake. The moonlight illuminated our campsite, and the fire still flickered weakly. But when we arrived, we froze in horror. Our gear was scattered, the tent torn apart. In the center of the camp was a message carved into the ground with something dark and sticky. "Thanks for playing." Panic set in, and we grabbed what we could. We didn't speak, didn't look back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. The last thing I saw was the cabin, standing silent and foreboding, the laughter echoing in my mind. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes I still hear the whispers, drawing me back to the woods. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs, and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, but this time I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods, but one October evening still stands out in my mind. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. I was assigned the late shift, my radio crackling softly as I moved through the trails, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. It was a typical night until I received a call from a couple camping in a secluded area about 10 miles into the woods. They reported hearing strange noises, a mix of growls and whispers that sent shivers down their spines. I tried to calm them, assuring them it was likely just a nearby animal, but their fear was palpable. I told them I would head their way and check things out. The hike to their campsite was uneventful at first, the familiar sounds of the forest filling my ears. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds faded, and an unnatural silence enveloped me. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, hoping to coax it back to life. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and I quickened my pace. When I finally reached the couple's campsite, the sight that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. Their tent stood in disarray, the zipper partially open, and belongings scattered around as if a storm had swept through. But the couple was nowhere to be found. I called out their names, but only silence answered. My instincts kicked in, and I moved cautiously, scanning the area. As I walked further into the woods, I stumbled upon a trail of what looked like deep claw marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees. My heart raced as I followed the marks, trying to piece together what had happened. Each claw mark seemed to lead deeper into the shadows, beckoning me forward. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I took a deep breath and pressed on, hoping to find the couple or at least something that would explain their disappearance. As I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of movement. My heart raced as I followed the movement, adrenaline surging through me. I stumbled upon a small clearing where I saw a figure standing with its back to me. It was tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. My instinct screamed for me to run, but curiosity held me in place. I called out softly, asking if they were okay, but the figure remained motionless. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a cautious step closer. Just as I was about to reach out, the figure turned. My stomach dropped as I caught sight of its face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back in shock, and the figure opened its mouth to let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned to flee, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted back the way I came. Behind me, the figure's scream echoed through the trees, a haunting sound that filled the air. I could hear the rustling of leaves and snapping branches as it pursued me, but I didn't dare look back. I finally burst through the tree line and into the clearing where the couple's tent still stood. Panting, I skidded to a stop, turning to face the forest. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The growling returned, echoing through the trees, and I prepared for whatever might come. Just then, the couple emerged from the woods, their faces pale with fear. They looked as if they had seen a ghost, and I couldn't help but feel relief wash over me. They told me they had wandered off looking for firewood and had gotten lost, but as I looked back into the forest, I noticed something chilling. The figure I had seen was standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching us with those same hollow eyes. I grabbed the couple and we hiked back to the ranger station, glancing over our shoulders, convinced that whatever had followed us was still lurking in the shadows. We made it safely back, but as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let something dark escape the woods that night, a presence that was no longer confined to the deep trees. The night was deeper than usual, the kind of darkness that feels like it has weight. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights in the woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring campers were safe. But this evening felt different. A chill ran through the air, making my skin prickle. The trees loomed above me like ancient giants, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes against the moonlight. Earlier in the day, a family had set up camp near the lake. They were a cheerful group, chatting and laughing as they roasted marshmallows. I'd stopped to make sure they were aware of the park's safety rules, especially about keeping food secure from wildlife. Little did I know that this simple encounter would haunt me. As darkness enveloped the forest, I began my usual rounds. The sounds of the woods were all too familiar: the rustling leaves, the distant hoots of owls, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. But then, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. A woman's scream echoed through the trees. It was raw and desperate, cutting through the tranquil night like a knife. My heart raced as I sprinted toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the lake, the screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made my stomach drop. The family's campfire still flickered in the distance, but their voices were gone. I reached their campsite, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly over the area, searching for any sign of them. The tent stood undisturbed, but the air felt wrong. I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Panic set in as I turned to check the trail leading away from the lake. That's when I saw a shadow darting between the trees, too quick for me to catch a clear glimpse. My instinct screamed for me to run, but I had a duty to protect these campers. I had to find them. I moved cautiously along the path, my flashlight illuminating the foliage as I pushed deeper into the woods. The darkness felt alive, closing in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting. Just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon a clearing. There, at the center, was a large figure crouched low, its back to me. I froze, my breath hitching. The figure was wearing something that resembled a tattered shirt, and I could see matted hair hanging down its back. My mind raced with horror stories of what could lurk in the depths of the forest. I stepped back slowly, but the sound of my movement caught its attention. The figure turned, and my blood ran cold. Its face was grotesque, a twisted mockery of a human. Eyes wide and bulging, it opened its mouth in a silent scream. A wave of terror washed over me, and I turned to flee. I sprinted back toward the camp, adrenaline pushing me forward. I couldn't shake the feeling of being haunted, something lurking just out of sight. When I reached the campsite, I found the family emerging from the woods, faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked as if they had seen a ghost. I rushed to them, relief flooding through me. But before I could ask if they were okay, the mother spoke, her voice trembling. She said they had heard whispers in the trees, voices calling to them in the dark. Then, before I could process what she was saying, I caught a glimpse of the figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. I turned to the family, urging them to pack their things quickly. We needed to leave. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, but the signal was weak and crackling. Just as the family hastily packed their gear, I felt a sudden, icy breath on my neck. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the dark. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered like a heavy fog. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and the force seemed to whisper around us. We managed to get everything packed, and I led them away from the lake, my heart racing. I kept glancing back, half expecting the figure to reappear. When we reached the main road, I finally exhaled, the tension slowly lifting. But as I turned to reassure the family, I saw something that made my blood run cold. They were smiling, their eyes unblinking and vacant. They weren't scared at all. In fact, they seemed utterly calm, as if nothing had happened. My heart raced again, but for a different reason. I stepped back, confusion taking over. They weren't the same people I had spoken to earlier. The woman tilted her head, her grin widening, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come looking for us." The forest felt alive around me, pulsing with something dark and sinister. I stumbled backward, realizing that the woods had claimed them as its own. As I turned to run, the laughter of the family echoed behind me, a haunting reminder of what had happened in those deep woods. It was a quiet evening when we decided to drive out to the old orchard on the edge of town. I had heard stories about it being haunted, but they were just that, stories. I was with a group of friends, all of us looking for a break from the same old routine. The moon was full, casting a pale glow that made the rows of gnarled apple trees look like twisted, skeletal sentinels. As we parked the car and stepped out, the silence swallowed us whole. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just the cold wind cutting through the branches and the sound of our feet crunching over the gravel path. The air was heavy, as if it were holding its breath. We wandered through the orchard, laughing and daring each other to go farther. It was just a bit of fun, a way to make memories. But then we reached the center of the orchard, where the trees were so dense they blocked out most of the moonlight. The ground here was soft and spongy, and something felt off. One of my friends, Mark, bent down to pick up a rock, brushing his hand against the damp earth. "Hey, look at this," he said, holding up the rock. It was cracked, but that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the pale, sinewy root that curled around the rock, creeping like a finger. "Come on, that's just a root," Sarah said, but her voice trembled. The breeze picked up, carrying with it a low, groaning sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the orchard. We all looked at each other, uneasy. Suddenly, without warning, the ground beneath our feet shuddered. It was a soft tremor at first, but then it grew, vibrating so violently that I almost fell. In the panic, we shouted for each other to move, but no one wanted to break free of the circle we had formed. That's when I saw it. From between the twisted roots and the base of the trees, something emerged. It was thin, impossibly long, with limbs that bent in the wrong directions. Its skin was ashy gray, and its eyes were black wells that seemed to pull at my sanity. It reached out, claw-like hands stretched to the sky. "Run!" I yelled, and the group scattered, leaving me behind as I stumbled over the rough ground. The trees around us creaked and groaned as if alive, the roots shifting and moving like they were trying to trip us up, to pull us back into the dirt. I was the last to make it to the edge of the orchard, just as I reached the line of trees where the moonlight shone through. I glanced back and saw it standing there, watching me. The thing didn't follow, but its black eyes locked onto mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. It whispered something. The voice was the sound of scraping rock, a word I couldn't make out, but I knew it was speaking my name. I ran without stopping until I hit the road and found my friends, panting and wide-eyed. We didn't look back as we drove away, the engine roaring against the silence behind us. The next day, I returned to the orchard, wanting to prove to myself that it had been an illusion. But when I got there, it was just as it always had been, silent, desolate, a place that seemed forgotten. I noticed, however, that in the soil, where the rock had been picked up the night before, there was a shallow impression of a handprint, long, slender fingers etched in the dirt as if someone had pressed against the earth, trying to reach out. I left without saying a word to anyone. That night, as I lay in bed, the same whisper came back to me, this time louder, clearer. It called my name again, from somewhere far in the distance, and I knew it would never stop. I never thought anything could scare me like that night did. I was working the night shift at a small, 24-hour gas station, the kind that has the flickering neon sign and a single, worn-out bench for people to sit on. The station was in a town that felt abandoned in the dark, a place where the only noise was the wind rattling the old gas pumps and the occasional truck that drove through on the way to somewhere else. It was around 3 a.m. when the first strange thing happened. A black sedan pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin daggers. The sedan sat there for a moment too long, then pulled forward slowly, as if waiting for something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe the driver was waiting for a friend. Maybe he was just tired. But then I noticed it, a shadow flitting across the windshield, moving so fast that I wasn't sure if I'd seen it at all. My heart thumped louder as I took a breath. Trying to steady myself, the car suddenly jerked forward, headlights flashing briefly in my direction before it sped off into the darkness. I watched it disappear down the long, empty road, my pulse pounding in my ears. Just as I was about to turn back to my work, I heard a noise behind me shuffling, like someone was dragging their feet across the cracked tile floor. I turned sharply, eyes wide. The place was empty except for me. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went back to stocking the shelves, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Minutes passed, Or maybe hours. The night felt heavier, like something was pressing down on my chest. It was nearing 4 a.m. when the next car pulled in. This one was an old, rusty pickup truck, the kind that looked like it should have been retired decades ago. I looked out at it, the driver's side door creaking open slowly. But again, no one stepped out. I stepped back from the counter, heart slamming into my ribs as I stared at the open door. Then I saw him, a man, hunched over, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. He shuffled toward the door of the gas station, eyes locked on mine, and I realized late that he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows of the truck bed, I saw a second figure, its shape more like an elongated, cloud shadow than anything human. My hands went cold, and a shiver raced down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the man reached for the door handle. A high-pitched, inhuman screech split the silence, and I jumped, grabbing the phone from the counter and dialing 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice on the other end. I couldn't speak, couldn't tear my eyes away as the first man's mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. The shadow behind him stepped forward, and in the bright neon light, I saw its true form, a twisted, half-human shape, dripping with something dark and glistening. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were black and hollow, filled with a cold, infinite hunger. The dispatcher's voice brought me back to reality. Sir, are you there? What's happening? I opened my mouth to scream, but couldn't make a sound. The figures outside the window were moving, circling the building, and I knew I had only moments before they found a way in. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. I ducked behind the counter and waited, hearing the slapping sound of wet feet on tile as they moved closer. Then everything went silent. The silence was worse than any noise, and I knew that something had changed. I stood up cautiously and peeked over the counter, my chest aching with every breath. The gas station was empty. No figures, no strange sounds, just the hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the clock on the wall. The phone in my hand felt hot, like it had a pulse of its own. I could still hear the dispatcher on the line, asking if I was okay. I nodded, a shaky laugh escaping me as I whispered, "I'm okay now." But as I looked out the window, I noticed something chilling. The black sedan was back, parked across the street, engine idling. I stared at the rearview mirror, where a face stared back at me with eyes as hollow and dark as the figure that had been outside. They were still here. It was supposed to be an easy night out, a few friends, and I had decided to go stargazing. We found a quiet, isolated hilltop that overlooked the city, far away from the bright lights and noise. The evening had been perfect at first, with the sky an endless sea of stars, a cool breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers, and laughter as we set up our blankets and telescoped out. As the night deepened, the air became colder, more oppressive. We didn't mind at first. We were too busy taking turns peering through the telescope and making silly jokes. But the deeper we went into the night, the more the landscape around us seemed to change. The trees, which had been a comforting ring of shadows, now felt like they were watching us, their branches moving in strange, unnatural ways. The rustling wasn't the wind, it was as if the forest had a life of its own. I shifted on my blanket and glanced at my phone. It was nearly midnight, and I was starting to feel an inexplicable sense of dread. Just as I opened my mouth to say something, one of my friends, Jenna, screamed. We all turned to see her standing by the edge of the hill, her face pale, eyes wide. "What is it?" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "There's someone down there," she gasped, pointing into the dark. We all stared in the direction she indicated, but I couldn't see anything, just the inky blackness of the forest below. "Jenna, there's no one there," Matt said, trying to sound reassuring. But there was a tremble in his voice that made my skin crawl. "No, look," she insisted, eyes locked on something in the trees. I squinted, heart thudding in my chest as I tried to see what she saw. It wasn't a person. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long and bendy, like a scarecrow brought to life. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and even from a distance, I could tell it was staring right at us. "Guys, we need to go." "Now," I said, my voice cracking. We gathered our things, but as we started back toward the car, the sound of footsteps came from behind us, uneven and dragging. It felt as though the woods were closing in, surrounding us with the faint, dry rustling of leaves and the thud of heavy feet. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a second figure, this one closer, emerging from the dark. Its eyes were hollow and glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly yellow. My breath caught in my throat as we broke into a run, the air sharp with panic and the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. Go, 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 Matt shouted, pushing past me. We all sprinted for the car, the night echoing with the crunch of footsteps behind us. When we finally reached the vehicle, I fumbled to unlock it. Heart racing as the shadows stretched and shifted around us, we piled into the car, and I slammed the door shut, locking it just as a figure emerged at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with those hollow eyes. It tilted its head slowly, a broken, jerky motion that made my blood run cold. Drive, drive, Jenna shouted, and Matt didn't hesitate. The tires screeched against the gravel as we peeled away, the headlights slicing through the darkness. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures, their twisted bodies still watching us, still following, until they vanished back into the woods. We didn't stop until we were safely back in town. Every one of us is shaken to speak, but as I lay in bed that night, trying to find sleep, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing, hollow eyes watching us from the dark. The next day, I went back to the hilltop with a friend, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But when we arrived, I found something that made my stomach twist. At the base of the trees were deep, wide tracks footprints with long, claw-like toes that seemed to stretch into the woods, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. And in the distance, I swore I heard a voice, ragged and whispering, coming from the dark, saying, "You are not supposed to leave." I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, sharing a story that still keeps me up at night. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't an extravagant place, but it was tucked away in a secluded part of the forest, far from civilization. Perfect for a group of friends looking to disconnect. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the air crisp with the scent of pine. We settled in, made ourselves comfortable, and as evening fell, we gathered around the fireplace. It felt perfect, but things began to feel off. At first, I thought it was the isolation or maybe the silence that surrounded the cabin, but it was more than that. It felt like we were being watched. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. The house grew quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the sense of unease that gnawed at me. It wasn't long before I heard something faint, at first, like soft tapping at my window. I convinced myself it was just the wind, the trees brushing against the house. But then it came again, louder. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something was knocking at my window. I lay there, paralyzed, heart pounding in my chest. The knocks grew faster, then stopped. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I turned on my side, trying to ignore it, willing myself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. I heard the sounds again, but this time they weren't from the window. It was at the door, slow, deliberate knocks, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I sat up in bed, frozen, and listened. Then came the voice. "Let me in." It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was real, but it felt like it was coming from right outside my door. My heart raced. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time more insistent. "Let me in." I finally worked up the courage to peek through the crack in the door, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty hallway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to the others. They were all still sound asleep when I woke up, so I kept my nerves to myself. But as we sat around the breakfast table, one of my friends, Laura, spoke up. "I heard something weird last night," she said, her voice shaky. Like, knocking at my window. It was like someone was outside. I thought I was just imagining it, but now I'm not sure. The others exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said much. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't the only one. Later that day, we decided to take a walk in the woods to clear our heads. We spent hours hiking, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around us, the unnatural silence that seemed to follow us wherever we went. It wasn't normal. That evening, we sat around the fire again, trying to enjoy the night. But the strange feeling lingered, like an invisible presence watching us. When we went to bed, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I kept hearing things outside, the same tapping, the same whispering. It was like it was trying to get in. But what terrified me the most was when I heard someone whisper my name. It was clear as day. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and rushed to the window. There was nothing there. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. I couldn't explain it. I had to stay calm. The next morning, we packed up early. None of us spoke much, but there was an unspoken understanding. We were all on edge, and none of us wanted to stay another night. As we walked to the car, I glanced back at the cabin. That's when I saw at the front door. It was wide open. We had all locked it the night before. I didn't wait to investigate. We piled into the car and drove off in a hurry. But, as we left the woods behind, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror, just for a second. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. I don't know who or what it was, but I'll never forget the feeling. It was like we were being followed, watched by something that wasn't quite human. After that weekend, I tried to forget it. I told myself it was all in my head, just a trick of the mind. But when I looked at the photos we took during the trip, I saw something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, standing at the cabin's doorway, was a shadowy figure, just out of focus, and it wasn't any of us. To this day, I don't know what we encountered, but I know one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't human. My friends and I were excited for a weekend getaway. We rented a cabin in a remote area, far away from the noise and chaos of city life. None of us were really into anything spooky, and we thought it would be a peaceful escape. The cabin itself was old but charming, with wood-paneled walls and an inviting fireplace. We arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked, and decided to explore the surrounding woods. There were no trails, just thick, dense trees that seemed to go on forever. It was peaceful, almost quiet. I felt like we were the only people on Earth, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. That evening, after dinner, we gathered around the fireplace and told stories. We laughed a lot, drank wine, and enjoyed each other's company. But as night fell, the wind picked up. It howled against the windows, and the old house creaked under the pressure. We joked about the house being haunted, but it was all in good fun until things took a turn. Around midnight, we heard something from the back of the cabin. It sounded like a door creaking, followed by heavy footsteps. At first, we thought it was just the house selling. But when the footsteps grew louder and closer, I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The others looked at me, their faces as confused as mine. But no one said anything. We waited, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slowly, deliberately. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was moving through the house. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's messing around?" I asked, trying to sound brave. No answer. I glanced around at my friends, but they looked just as scared as I felt. We all gathered near the hallway, straining to hear. The sound of footsteps was so close now that I could almost feel them vibrating through the floorboards. One of my friends, Ryan, slowly crept toward the hallway. He mustered the courage to call out, "Hello. Who's there?" No response. The silence after that was deafening. Then, suddenly, the floorboards creaked loudly from the other side of the room, followed by a sharp knock on the wall. We all jumped. "Okay, that's it. Let's get out of here," said Sarah, her voice shaky, but we couldn't leave. The wind had picked up so strongly outside that the front door was now jammed shut. The knocking from the other side of the room persisted, growing louder. Like someone was trying to get in. We huddled together in the living room, terrified. We thought about calling the police, but none of us had a signal on our phones. The atmosphere was thick with dread. Then, the lights flickered, and the knocking stopped. A cold breeze swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. I looked toward the front door. It was slightly ajar. I swear it hadn't been When we had last checked, we moved as a group, cautiously toward the door. Ryan tried to close it, but the handle wouldn't turn. He pulled harder. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with a violent bang. We screamed, and then, the voice came soft at first, but growing louder. "Let me in," it whispered. We all froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside the door, though. It was coming from inside the cabin. The voice seemed to echo through the walls, reverberating all around us. I was about to turn and run when I noticed something strange. The air near the fireplace seemed to shimmer. At first, I thought it was the heat from the flames, but then I saw an outline, like a figure standing in the doorway. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Everyone nodded, their faces pale and wide-eyed. We had to leave. But how? I ran toward the back door, desperate to find a way out, but as soon as I opened it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure was standing in the yard, just beyond the threshold, watching us. I slammed the door shut and turned to my friends. We were trapped, and that's when the whispering started again, louder, clearer. "Let me in." It was the same voice as before, but now it sounded closer, as if it was right behind me. We all bolted for the front door, desperate to escape. When we opened it, the wind howled, and we ran out into the woods without looking back. We made it to our car, heartbeats racing. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, just watching us leave. I'll never forget that feeling of being watched. We made it out, but that place wasn't empty. Something had been there with us the entire time. Something that was still waiting for us to return, and I don't think it will ever stop. I've always loved old houses, the creaking floors, the smell of dust and history. It all felt comforting to me. So, when a friend of mine offered me a weekend stay in a remote house she had recently inherited, I jumped at the chance. It was an isolated 2-story place, surrounded by thick woods, and from the moment I arrived, something about it felt off. The first night, I felt fine. My friend had warned me about the odd noises, saying it was just an old house settling, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't heard anything normal. Every creak, every faint whisper in the walls made my skin crawl. I brushed it off. It was just the house settling, right. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch downstairs. The upstairs felt too isolated, too empty. I tried to make myself comfortable, wrapping myself in a blanket as the night grew colder. The wind outside howled, but it didn't bother me much. I'd always liked the sound of a storm. At around 3 a.m., I was woken by a strange noise. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped. I knew no one was supposed to be here with me. I stood up, thinking maybe my friend had come down for something, but when I peeked upstairs, the hall was empty. I stood frozen, trying to decide whether I should go back to sleep or investigate. The footsteps grew louder. They were now coming down the stairs. I froze, not daring to move. The stairs creaked with each step. 1, 2, 3. I could hear the weight of each footfall, as if someone was walking slowly down toward me, but when I looked, no one was there. My pulse quickened. I looked over at the staircase, feeling an overwhelming urge to check. Slowly, I stood and made my way to the foot of the stairs. The air had gotten colder, almost icy, but nothing was there. No one was coming down. Relieved, I laughed to myself, thinking it must have been my mind playing tricks. I walked back to the couch, but as I sat down, the unmistakable sound of breathing reached my ears. It was slow, steady, but coming from right behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone there. But nothing. The room was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my head was spinning. Maybe it was just my nerves and overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I got up and locked all the doors. I even pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't pinpoint why. When I checked the windows, everything outside was dark, still. No movement, just the wind. Around 4 a.m., I decided to leave the house. I didn't feel safe there anymore, but as I grabbed my bag, something caught my eye in the hallway mirror. It was my reflection only. It wasn't quite right. I stared at the mirror, confused. My reflection was smiling, I wasn't smiling. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse racing, but when I looked back, it was gone. The smile was gone, and the reflection seemed normal again. I grabbed my things and ran out of the house, not looking back until I was safely in my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in there. Watching me. The next morning, I got a message from my friend. It was a simple text. "Did you hear anything last night?" I texted her back, asking what she meant. Her response sent a chill down my spine. "I forgot to tell you there's a family who used to live there. They all died in a fire in the house years ago. People say their spirits are trapped in the walls, still walking around, still breathing." I felt my stomach drop. What did I see in that mirror? Was it one of them? Had they been there all along, waiting for someone to notice? The last thing she wrote haunted me long after I left. The weird thing is, sometimes people leave that house, but they never seem to fully leave. The spirits follow them, always. Now, months later, I still don't sleep well. And sometimes, when I glance at a mirror, I swear I see a faint, twisted smile in the reflection, someone, or something, just behind me. But when I turn around, nothing is there, and I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting to follow me again. I'll never forget the night my friends and I decided to take a trip to that abandoned house. It wasn't a grand plan. We were just a group of college students looking for something to do on a Saturday night, and when someone mentioned the old mansion at the edge of town, we all jumped at the chance. It had been sitting there, untouched, for years, just a hulking structure, faded by time and nature, covered in stories we had all heard but never truly believed. Everyone said it was haunted. Everyone said we were crazy to go. But of course, that only made it more tempting. We packed flashlights, snacks, and a camera for good measure. After a short hike through the overgrown path that led to the house, we finally arrived at the front door. It was exactly as we'd imagined: creaky, ancient wood with rusted metal hinges. The windows were boarded up, and ivy crept over the stone walls like it was trying to pull the house back into the earth. The kind of place you'd expect to be in a horror movie. We laughed nervously as we pushed the door open. The smell hit us immediately: mildew, dust, and something more metallic, almost like cold blood. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a long hallway with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered everywhere. We joked about how eerie it looked, but even I could feel the chill in the air, a sense of heaviness that made every step feel slower than it should. We decided to explore the house room by room, each more unsettling than the last. The living room was filled with shattered glass, and the dining room had a long table covered in rotting remnants of food that had long since turned to mush. There was an overwhelming sense that time had stopped here, that the place was frozen in some terrible moment, but we didn't stop. It was all part of the fun until we found the staircase. At the top of the stairs, the air felt different, colder. We shone our lights around, and that's when I saw it, a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a sudden urge to turn back, but curiosity won out. I led the way. The room behind that door was much smaller than the others, barely furnished except for a single rocking chair in the corner. It faced the wall, but something was odd about it. The floor around the chair was covered in what looked like old, faded chalk marks. I moved closer to get a better look, but then the air shifted. A loud creak echoed through the room, so loud it made my heart skip a beat. The chair moved just slightly at first, as though someone had shifted their weight in it. I froze. My friends looked at me, unsure of what to say. One of them whispered, asking if I had touched it. I hadn't. We all gathered near the door, the tension mounting, as the chair began to rock back and forth, slowly at first, then faster, as though something or someone was pushing it from behind. That was when we heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. "Leave." I didn't know if it was the wind, my imagination, or something else, but the voice was unmistakable. It was as though it came from all directions, vibrating through the walls and the floor. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The chair stopped. For a split second, I thought maybe we had imagined everything. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something, a reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. It wasn't mine. A figure stood behind me, its pale face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural grin. I whipped around, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The door slammed shut. We screamed, racing to get out, the floor creaking beneath our feet as we sprinted back down the hall, stumbling over the debris in our panic. As we finally reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt thick with something cold and suffocating. I was the last to reach the door, and just as my hand touched the handle, I heard it again, that whisper, "Leave now, or you'll stay." I yanked the door open, and we spilled into the night air, gasping for breath, hearts pounding in our chests. The house stood silent behind us, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town, each of us too scared to speak, too shaken to process what had just happened. When we got home, we tried to laugh it off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Something that didn't want us to leave. That night, as I was about to fall asleep, I checked my phone, and that's when I saw the message. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The text was simple, chilling. "You left too soon. I couldn't breathe." It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and my friends getting away from the chaos of everyday life. We had all agreed on a remote camping spot deep in the woods, a place that was far from any hiking trails and even farther from the nearest ranger station. It was meant to be the perfect escape. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun still hanging low in the sky. The trees here were dense, the canopy thick enough to block out much of the light. We set up camp quickly, unpacking our gear and starting a fire as dusk settled in. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, and for a while, everything felt normal. We joked and laughed, swapping stories and trying to ignore the growing sense of isolation the deep woods seemed to encourage. But as night fully descended, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No animals, no rustling of leaves, no distant sounds of water, just an unnatural stillness. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just the remoteness of the area, that everything would be fine. Then we heard it, a low, deep thud, almost like something heavy dropping to the ground. It came from the woods. Beyond the firelight, we all froze. My stomach twisted as I scanned the dark line of trees, unable to see anything through the thick underbrush. "It's probably an animal," one of my friends suggested, but his voice trembled. I couldn't argue with him. It had to be an animal, right? We tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. A few minutes later, another thud, this time louder, closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at my friends, but they were just as tense as I was. "Maybe we should check it out," one of them suggested, though he clearly wasn't as eager as his words implied. We all stared at the trees, now far darker than before. Something about it didn't feel right. We decided to investigate, against our better judgment. With flashlights in hand, we stepped into the woods, the beam cutting through the dark, our steps cautious. The air was unnervingly still, the only sounds the crunch of dry leaves beneath our boots. Then it happened. From behind a thick cluster of trees, something shot out at us, a flash of motion, quick and too fast to be anything natural. We screamed and scattered, the beam of my flashlight flickering wildly as I turned in every direction, my heart racing. I couldn't see anything but shadows. "Did you see that?" someone shouted. "I don't know," I stammered, panic bubbling up inside me. My breath came in short gasps, my mind racing. We huddled together, trying to calm ourselves, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't describe. My mind kept replaying what I had seen, a figure, but not like any animal, too tall, too thin. It seemed to vanish as soon as the light hit it. We headed back to camp quickly, our hearts still pounding in our chests. Once there, we all stayed silent, the fire crackling louder than it should. We avoided looking at each other, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the unease sinking deeper into our bones. Then, the noise came again. This time it wasn't a thud. It was a soft scraping sound, like something or someone dragging across the ground. My stomach lurched. It came from the trees again, but closer, too close. We all jumped to our feet, shining our flashlights toward the noise, but nothing. The woods were silent once more. That's when it hit me, there was something wrong. We weren't alone. Suddenly, the bushes near the edge of our camp rustled violently. I jumped back, my flashlight flicking erratically as I spun to face it. The noise came again, closer, as if something was right there, just beyond the reach of the light. My heart raced in my chest as I backed away. but I didn't want to be the first to run. We stood frozen, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. No movement, no sound, just a heavy silence that pressed down on us. I was about to call out when the ground under my feet shifted. I stumbled back, my flashlight cutting across the ground just in time to catch something strange, a mark. A large, wide indent in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the earth. That's when I realized the true horror. It wasn't just one thing in the woods. It was everywhere. I turned, eyes wide, and scanned the trees again. And that's when I saw it to glowing eyes, set deep in the shadows. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too still. We didn't wait. We packed up everything in a frenzy, my hands shaking as I tossed things into my backpack. We rushed to the car, not even pausing to check if anything was following us. The entire drive home, none of us spoke. We couldn't explain what had happened, but we all felt it. Whatever was out there in the woods, watching us, had been waiting for something, and we had gotten too close. It was supposed to be an easygoing weekend trip, just a simple getaway deep in the woods with my friends. We planned everything out: tents, food, flashlights, and extra batteries. We'd chosen a spot by the lake, miles from the nearest road, so we wouldn't see another soul for days. The first day went perfectly, hiking, swimming, laughing by the fire as the sun went down. The isolation made everything feel a little surreal, like we'd stepped into a world of our own. It was after dinner, with night fully settled around us, that Yena suggested we explore the area. She'd always been the adventurous one, pushing us to do things we wouldn't otherwise. We took our flashlights and set off, joking that she was leading us on a ghost hunt. As we walked, the woods thickened, swallowing our voices and muffling our laughter. Shadows danced along the ground, strange in the beams of our flashlights, and the trees grew denser, leaning over us like they were watching. At some point, the trail split off, and Yena darted ahead before anyone could stop her. We tried calling her back, but she laughed and said she'd meet us back at camp in a few minutes. Not wanting to argue, we kept walking, staying on the main path. We turned back after a while, realizing we'd been gone longer than we'd planned, and headed to the campsite. We figured Yena would already be there, probably lying in wait to jump out and scare us, but the campsite was empty when we returned. Her things were still where she'd left them, untouched. The fire was almost out, just a few embers crackling quietly, casting a faint orange glow over the tents. Panic started to creep in, and we called her name, listening to our voices echo into the dark trees. Silence answered us, thick and unnerving. The minutes ticked by, and then the hours. By now, it was close to midnight, and our nerves were stretched thin. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, made us whip around, expecting Yena to jump out. But the silence dragged on. Just as we were about to head into the woods to search for her, we saw a faint light bobbing in the trees. Relief surged through us. Yena was finally back. But as the light grew closer, something was off. The way it swayed wasn't like a flashlight. It moved fluidly, almost like it was floating. We called out to her, but there was no answer. The light kept moving closer, slow and deliberate, weaving through the trees. Then we saw it, a figure in the dark, cloaked in shadows. It wasn't Yena. The figure was too tall, its movements too stiff. Whoever it was held a lantern that flickered with an unnatural glow, a greenish light that seemed to pulse in the darkness. Chains rattled as the figure moved closer, dragging across the ground, loud and metallic. My heart pounded as we stumbled back, retreating toward the camp. But the figure kept coming, each step slow, unhurried. The light from the lantern cast strange shadows over its face. It wore a mask, pale and featureless, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through us. I grabbed my friends, and we hid behind a nearby fallen tree, peering out as the figure entered our camp. It stopped by Gina's tent, standing still as if listening. The chains clanked softly as it reached down, running its hand over her things, pausing for a moment before moving to the next tent. My breath caught in my throat as it lifted the lantern, casting light over the empty tents, the coolers, the dying fire. Then it leaned down, scratching something into the ground with the tip of a chain, the metal scraping against the earth with a terrible sound. After what felt like hours, the figure turned, vanishing back into the trees, the light from the lantern fading with it. We stayed hidden until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Only then did we dare to creep back to our camp, every step careful, as if that figure might suddenly reappear. On the ground, where the figure had knelt, were 3 words carved deeply into the dirt. "She's with us." Gina's belongings were gone. Her backpack, her sleeping bag, even her shoes were missing. Everything she'd brought had disappeared without a trace, leaving no sign that she'd ever been there at all. Without a word, we packed up, leaving behind whatever we couldn't carry. We didn't stop walking until we reached the car, not even looking back as we sped down the narrow, winding road away from that place. To this day, I can still hear the clanking of those chains in my nightmares, and sometimes, just when I think I've forgotten, I'll catch a faint whiff of that strange greenish light just for a second. None of us ever found out what happened to Yena, but we know one thing for certain. Whoever, or whatever, that figure was, it wasn't human. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. "Is that a person?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that thing?" he gasped. "I don't know, but we should pack up and leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. "The fire," he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. "What the hell?" Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. "Get away from the fire," I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, the fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clear now, dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story I'd heard years ago about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows, eyes glinting like hungry predators. We reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip with friends. We chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the sounds of the city. The kind of place where you can hear the rustle of leaves and feel the crunch of twigs beneath your feet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, laughing and telling stories. The air was filled with the smell of roasting marshmallows and the crackling of burning wood. Jenna suggested we go for a night hike to embrace the wilderness. The others were hesitant, but I felt adventurous. The mushrooms we had consumed earlier made everything feel magical, and I wanted to explore. The darkness felt like an invitation, pulling us into its depths. We grabbed our flashlights, the beams slicing through the night like knives. As we wandered deeper into the woods, the trees closed in around us, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the starry sky. We chatted nervously, but the mood shifted when we heard a sudden rustling. It was louder than any animal we'd encountered, like something large was moving through the underbrush. We froze, exchanging anxious glances. Then we heard a low growl that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a wolf. This was something different, something wrong. Before we could react, Jenna pointed ahead, her flashlight beam flickering over something in the distance. My heart raced as I strained to see what it was. Through the trees, a figure emerged. A man, or at least, he looked like one. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as if he had never seen sunlight. He wore ragged clothes that hung loosely from his body, and his hair was wild, matted with leaves and dirt. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel the emptiness in his eyes. Like he was staring right through us, we instinctively backed away, trying to remain silent. But in our panic, Jenna accidentally stepped on a twig, the sound snapping through the air like a gunshot. The figure jerked his head toward us, and the growl intensified. Fear took hold, and we bolted into the trees, heartbeats racing and breath coming in short gasps. We ran without direction, branches scratching at our arms and legs as we tore through the underbrush. The growl was now a roar, echoing in the night. We could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate. It felt like something was chasing us, hunting us. I glanced back and saw the man was following, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. We finally stumbled upon a clearing, and without thinking, we hid behind a thick bush, our bodies pressed together, trembling. We listened as the footsteps grew closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I wanted to scream, but fear locked my voice away. Then silence. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought we had escaped. We remained crouched, hearts pounding, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Just when I thought we were safe, a rustling came from the bush right next to us. I nearly screamed when I turned my flashlight towards it, only to reveal a raccoon, its eyes reflecting the light before it scurried away. But we were not alone. A whisper came from the shadows. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable. As it grew louder, my heart sank. The voice was low and raspy, calling out Jenna's name. The darkness felt alive, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against us. We dared to look out from behind the bush. To our horror, we saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights. He was now closer, his mouth moving as he chanted Jenna's name over and over, each utterance dripping with malice. Just as I thought we were trapped forever, something incredible happened. The figure suddenly stopped, his eyes widened, and he stumbled back, looking terrified. He turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were paralyzed, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The chanting stopped, replaced by the sounds of the forest returning to normal. We slowly emerged from our hiding spot, still shaken, but relieved to be alive. As we made our way back to the campsite, we talked about what we had seen. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, even in the safety of the campfire. The horror of that night haunted us, but the morning brought a sense of relief. We quickly packed our things and left. Days later, I received a text from Jenna. She had done some research and discovered that the area we camped in was notorious for strange occurrences. Multiple reports of people vanishing had been recorded over the years, always near that same clearing. But what made my blood run cold was the final line of her message. There's something more. They say if you hear your name whispered in the woods, it means they are looking for you. Camping in the deep woods had always been my escape, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of life. I often went with a group of friends, but this time, I found myself alone. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy the quiet of nature, and maybe indulge in a little stargazing. Little did I know how the night would unfold. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, a perfect spot nestled between tall pines and a clear, babbling brook. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, almost as if nature was welcoming me. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and prepared some snacks as the sky shifted from orange to deep indigo. As darkness settled in, the forest transformed. The sounds of the day faded, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I pulled out my phone to check for service, but there was nothing, just a blank screen. I chuckled at my lack of foresight. No calls, no texts, just me and the wilderness. After a few hours of sitting by the fire, I decided to take a walk. I wandered along the edge of the brook, the water shimmering under the moonlight. Everything felt peaceful until I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the trees. I froze, straining to identify the source. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. The sound was similar to someone lightly banging a stick against a tree. Curious, I decided to follow it. As I moved deeper into the woods, the tapping grew louder, and with it came an unsettling feeling that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. An uncomfortable silence enveloped the area, the usual sounds of the forest replaced by an eerie stillness. My heart raced as I stood there, adrenaline coursing through me. I turned back toward the campsite, but paused when I caught a glimpse of something between the trees. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood still, its head tilted slightly as if observing me. I squinted, trying to make out any features, but it was just a dark silhouette. Panic surged within me, and I took a step back. The figure moved, its outline blurring as it stepped further into the darkness, disappearing completely. I turned on my heel and ran back to the fire, my pulse pounding in my ears. I collapsed into my camping chair, trying to calm my racing heart. I reassured myself that it was probably just an animal, but the fear gnawed at me. The fire crackled loudly, illuminating the surrounding trees and keeping the darkness at bay, but my unease lingered. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to poke the fire and try to shake off the dread. Just as I did, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart sank. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. I felt like a child again, afraid of the monsters lurking in the dark. As I sat there, a movement caught my eye from the corner of the clearing. A figure emerged from the trees, this time much closer. I stood up abruptly, ready to confront whatever it was. The flashlight beam revealed a woman, pale and disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She raised her hands, trembling. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "What happened?" I asked, stepping forward. "They're coming for me," she stammered, looking over her shoulder. "I don't know what they want, but they won't stop." My instincts kicked in, and I gestured for her to sit by the fire. "You're safe here." "Who is coming?" Just then, I heard it again, the rhythmic tapping, now closer than before. The woman's eyes widened further, and she let out a small whimper. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I glanced into the darkness, the tapping now turning into a chorus of discordant knocks. Suddenly, the fire flickered violently, as if something had passed through the light. I turned to look at the woman, but she had vanished. My heart dropped, and I stumbled back, casting the flashlight all around me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the world tilting as panic set in. Then I heard her voice, echoing from the darkness. "They're here." I stumbled back to the tent, desperate to escape whatever was haunting me. As I unzipped the door and stepped inside, I took a breath to steady myself. I closed my eyes, hoping to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them, the scene had changed. My campsite was now empty, devoid of any trace of my tent or the fire. All that remained was a crude drawing etched into the dirt where my campfire once burned. It reads simply, "We will find you." I stumbled back, realizing I wasn't alone. The rhythmic tapping returned, echoing through the trees, but this time I was not the one being hunted. I had become part of their twisted game, and the night was just beginning. The sun had set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the campsite as I finished my rounds. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the woods at night, but something about this evening felt different. The air was thick, and the wind whispered through the branches like an ominous warning. It was late October, and the chill in the air hinted at winter's approach. I was on my way back to the main office when I heard a faint, desperate cry echoing through the woods. It was unlike any animal call I had ever heard. I froze, straining my ears to catch it again. There it was, a chilling scream followed by a rustling in the bushes nearby. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my flashlight, turning toward the sound. I had always been taught to investigate, to help anyone in trouble. I began to walk slowly toward the noise, each step filled with uncertainty. As I moved deeper into the trees, the darkness enveloped me, and my flashlight beam flickered against the trunks. The scream came again, more frantic this time, urging me to hurry. I rounded a large oak and found myself at a small clearing. In the center was a campsite with a flickering fire, its warmth contrasting sharply with the chill in the air. I stepped closer, my heart racing as I called out to see if anyone was there. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. The campsite was empty, the tent still pitched, and the fire crackling quietly. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound behind me, a quick rustle of leaves, followed by an unmistakable growl. My breath hitched in my throat, and I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the dense tree line. I saw nothing, only the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I was about to turn back when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees, just beyond the light's reach. My heart raced as fear gripped me. I called out again, "Who's there?" "Show yourself." The growl came closer, a low rumble that reverberated in my chest. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I stepped cautiously toward the trees where I had seen the figure, every instinct telling me to turn back. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I spotted a flash of white, a shirt or a jacket vanishing deeper into the woods. I called after it, but there was only silence. Then, I noticed something on the ground, a child's teddy bear, its button eyes staring up at me, unblinking. My stomach twisted, a chill ran down my spine. Where had the child gone? Before I could dwell on the bear, the growl returned, this time much closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My flashlight flickered, and the beam caught something moving in the darkness. A large figure emerged from the shadows, its form grotesque and misshapen. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. It was a man, but not just any man. His limbs were elongated, and his skin appeared stretched over his bones. He grinned at me, revealing rows of jagged teeth, the moonlight glinting off them. He raised a hand as if to wave, but it was all wrong. I turned and ran, adrenaline propelling me through the trees. I could hear him behind me, his laughter echoing through the woods, sending ice through my veins. The path was familiar, but the fear twisted my perception. I raced past the empty campsite, barely glancing back, praying I could reach the main office. Just as I broke through the trees, I stumbled onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. I turned to look back, expecting to see the twisted figure closing in on me. But the woods were quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. The campsite remained untouched, the fire still crackling softly. I made it back to the office, heart pounding, ready to call for help. But as I reached for the door, I froze. In the office window stood a child, her face pale and expressionless. It was the same girl whose teddy bear I had found. She raised her hand and pointed at me, her finger tracing a line from my chest to her throat. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The man I had seen was not just a creature. He was a part of something much darker. I turned to run again, but the door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside with the specter of the forest's lost souls. I had been a park ranger for a few years, spending countless nights in the woods and feeling a sense of peace in the rustling leaves and the sounds of nature. But that October night, everything changed. The sky was dark, thick clouds cloaking the moon, and the air was heavy with an unsettling stillness. As I patrolled the trails, the crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. I was nearing a remote campsite when my radio crackled to life. A distressed voice came through. A group of campers had reported hearing strange noises outside their tents. The father insisted it sounded like someone or something was moving around their campsite, heavy footfalls and a low growl. I tried to calm him down, assuring him that it was probably just a bear, but I could hear the fear in his voice. After gathering my gear, I set off toward the campsite. The path was winding and overgrown, making it hard to see far ahead. With my flashlight cutting through the darkness, the trees cast long, eerie shadows that danced around me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I pressed forward, the feeling of being watched creeping in. When I finally reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the unsettling silence. I called out, but there was no response. I stepped closer and found the tent zipped up tight, a warning sign that sent a chill down my spine. I unzipped the door and peeked inside. It was empty, the sleeping bags neatly arranged as if no one had ever been there. My heart raced as I turned to look around the campsite. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise from the bushes nearby. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, moving with a jerky, unsettling gait. I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice cracked. The figure stopped and turned its head slowly, revealing hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me. I remembered my training and reached for my radio, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure didn't advance. It simply stood there, watching me. The woods around us felt like they were holding their breath, the air thick with anticipation. I turned and sprinted back down the path, my mind racing. I could hear branches snapping behind me and the sound of something following, moving faster than it should have been. As I ran, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me, the trees towering like sentinels. I burst out onto the main trail and didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and finally got inside, slamming the door shut. I took a moment to catch my breath before calling for backup, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, but inside I was a mess. While I waited for the other rangers to arrive, I decided to circle back to the campsite. Maybe I could find the family and lead them to safety. As I approached, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The area looked different, almost distorted. I scanned the trees but saw no sign of the figure. The tent was still zipped up tight, and the campsite was eerily quiet. I crept closer, my flashlight beam trembling. I unzipped the tent once more, but this time, it was empty. My heart sank. Where had they gone? A rustling noise drew my attention again, and I turned just in time to see the figure dart between the trees. Panic surged, and I turned to run, but as I did, I tripped over something hidden in the leaves. I fell forward and looked back. The figure was right there, only inches from me. But as I scrambled to my feet, something strange happened. The creature changed shape, morphing into the father from the camping family, his face twisted with fear. I blinked, and he vanished, replaced by shadows that danced among the trees. I stumbled back toward the road, my mind racing with confusion. Just as I reached the trailhead, the other rangers arrived. I told them everything, but as we searched the woods, we found nothing. No campers, no sign of a struggle, just an overwhelming silence. Days later, the park officials declared the area closed until further notice. But sometimes, when I walk the trails alone at night, I can still hear the rustling of leaves and that haunting growl. I wonder if the woods still hold the family, or if they became part of something far darker. The figure I saw, the one that looked like the father, was never found, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered in those woods still lingers, watching and waiting. As a park ranger, I had seen my fair share of strange occurrences in the deep woods, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on that chilly October evening. It was the end of the camping season, and the air was filled with a crispness that hinted at the winter to come. I was on patrol, ensuring the last few campers packed up and left before dark. I was nearing a secluded part of the park when I noticed a flickering light through the trees. Curious, I veered off the trail, thinking it might be a camper who had lost their way. The forest grew denser as I approached, and the sunlight dimmed. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where the shadows loomed heavier and the air turned thick with tension. As I crept closer, I saw a tent. The glow of a lantern inside flickered rhythmically, casting ghostly shadows. I called out, but there was no response. I cautiously stepped up to the tent and unzipped the flap. Inside was a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, all huddled together, fear etched on their faces. I asked what was wrong, and they glanced at each other, their eyes wide. The father spoke in a hushed tone, saying they heard strange noises outside. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but as the night progressed, it grew more unsettling. He mentioned hearing what sounded like whispers and the rustling of leaves. But then came the worst part. Just before I arrived, they saw a shadow pass by their tent, something tall and thin, that walked onto legs, but didn't look entirely human. I tried to reassure them, telling them it was probably just a deer or another animal. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I suggested they pack up and follow me back to the ranger station. They agreed, relieved to leave the tent behind. As we began to gather their things, I noticed something strange outside. The whispering had returned. It was a low, unintelligible sound, echoing from the depths of the trees. The family froze, their eyes darting around, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but all I could see was the black expanse of trees. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like an angry wind. I told everyone to stay close and led them away from the tent, my heart racing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind us. We turned to see the lantern flicker violently before going dark. Panic surged through the family as I pushed them to move faster. We trudged through the underbrush, branches snagging at our clothes, the whispers following us, echoing like a taunt. The feeling of being haunted crept into my bones. We reached the trail, and relief flooded over me as we emerged into the dim light of dusk. I hurried the family along the path, keeping an eye over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. My blood ran cold as the whispers shifted to a chilling laughter that made my stomach churn. I urged the family to keep moving, and we hurried down the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We finally reached the ranger station, where I quickly ushered them inside. As I locked the door behind us, I glanced back out into the woods. The figure was gone, but the laughter lingered, an echo that hung in the air. After the family calmed down, I began to explain what had happened, hoping to downplay the fear. But just then, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was another ranger reporting strange noises and shadows seen near a different campsite. My heart dropped as the realization hit me there were more campers in danger. I turned to the family and promised them they would be safe inside while I went to assist. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something that shouldn't be disturbed, something that was now angry at us for our intrusion. As I ventured back into the woods, the laughter returned, taunting me. I followed the sounds. Each step felt like a descent into madness. The trees closed in around me, and suddenly I tripped over a root, tumbling to the ground. When I looked up, the figure loomed over me, closer than before. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the station. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut and locked it, breathing heavily. I turned to find the family staring at me, their faces pale. But behind them, in the shadows, stood the very same figure that had chased us. Its eyes flickered in the dim light, a sinister grin spreading across its face. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The woods were alive, and it would always have a way to reclaim what was taken from it. The laughter echoed in my ears, and I knew we had merely survived a night in its domain. But as long as we remained vigilant, perhaps we could outlast its terrifying grasp. Just a few friends in the woods for some camping, hiking, and stargazing. Nothing out of the ordinary. But by the end of that trip, I'll never look at the woods the same way again. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the kind of perfect weather where the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. We set up camp near a quiet stream, the sound of running water soothing against the chirps of crickets. There were 4 of us, all in our mid-20s. Sarah, Jason, Mark, and me. We were all excited, talking and laughing while we unpacked. As evening rolled in, we started a fire, the orange glow flickering against the growing darkness. Sarah had brought a deck of cards. So, we began playing a game, while Mark roasted marshmallows. The forest around us felt peaceful, serene, and we had no reason to think anything would go wrong. That's when the first thing happened. It started with a strange noise. A rustling, like something heavy brushing against the trees. We paused mid-laugh, listening. It was coming from behind us, deeper into the woods. Probably just an animal, Jason said, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. But then the noise came again. This time, it was closer. I stood up, a little on edge. Do you think it's a bear? We're fine? Mark said, waving it off. Bears are usually scared of people. I didn't feel reassured. But as Sarah and Jason continued their card game, I forced myself to sit back down. The noise stopped as abruptly as it started. Night came quickly, and with it, a bone-chilling cold. We huddled around the fire, the crackling flames casting shadows in every direction. That's when I noticed something odd. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the firelight, there was movement. Figures dark, vague shapes that shifted between the trees. Did you see that? I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. Sarah didn't even look up. Probably deer, she said dismissively. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes kept darting to the shadows, expecting to see something or someone moving just out of view. At some point, we all went to bed. Our tents pitched just far enough apart that we had privacy, but still close enough to hear each other. The wind picked up in the night, whistling through the trees, making every creak and groan of the forest feel like something was creeping closer. I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, that rustling sound. This time, it was unmistakable, the heavy movement of something large and deliberate. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric of the tent above me. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed right outside. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay still. Suddenly, there was a sharp scratching at the side of my tent. My breath caught in my throat. It was deliberate, slow, like something with claws was testing the fabric. I wanted to scream, to yell for my friends, but I couldn't. I didn't dare move. The scratching stopped, and then the worst part came, a voice soft and chilling, like it was right next to my ear. It whispered my name. My blood ran cold. I didn't answer, not even a breath. I held my breath, listening for any further sound, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, without warning, the tent flap whipped open, sending a blast of cold air inside. I screamed. It was Mark, his eyes wide and panicked, his face pale. Get out of the tent. We didn't question him. We scrambled out, half-dressed, into the cold night air. The fire was out, and the woods around us felt unnaturally silent. Jason, always the skeptic, muttered, "What the hell's going on? Man, I swear to God," Mark said, shaking. I saw something outside. It wasn't human. We huddled together, staring into the dark, waiting for some sign of what Mark had seen. That's when we heard it again, the rustling, the snapping of twigs, the whispering voice. This time clearer. It was coming from all around us. That's when Sarah gasped. She pointed to the trees. There, in the distance, just past the tree line, were dozens of pale faces staring back at us. Their eyes were wide, their mouths hanging open, frozen in a strange expression of fear or pain. They weren't human. They were something else. I don't remember how we made it back to the car. All I know is that when we finally pulled out of that forest, we didn't look back. Not once. It wasn't until we were home that I realized something disturbing. That night, when we were huddling by the fire, I had noticed something strange on Sarah's hand. A small mark, almost like a scratch. It was gone the next day, as if it had never been there at all. But when I looked at her hand again later, when we were all back in the safety of our homes, the mark was back, a long, thin line, like a scratch from a claw, only this time, it was moving. Just a couple of friends and me, out in the wilderness, hiking and camping under the stars. The trailhead seemed normal at first, an old forest road winding through thick trees, the air fresh with pine and earth. We passed a few other hikers, but soon, the trail narrowed, and we found ourselves far from anyone else. By mid-afternoon, we found a perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. We set up camp, lit a fire, and settled in for the night. As dusk fell, the usual sounds of the forest began to fade. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. It didn't bother us at first. We figured it was just a quiet stretch of woods. Night came quickly, and as we sat around the fire, it was like the world around us had swallowed any remaining noise. No crickets, no owls, just silence. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. Then came the first strange thing. We heard a loud crack, like something heavy snapping a branch. What was that? My friend asked, his voice tight. We all stared into the dark woods beyond the firelight, but nothing was there. Maybe it was an animal, but something about it didn't sit right. I told everyone to stay close, and we tried to keep the mood light, making jokes and telling stories, but the silence around us only deepened. The fire popped and crackled, casting long, twisted shadows on the trees. Then, I felt the sensation that someone was watching us. I glanced around nervously, but nobody else seemed to notice. My friends were busy talking, laughing, unaware. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I stepped away from the fire to get some water from our cooler, and that's when I saw it, a figure, not far into the woods, standing still as stone. A shape, too tall to be a man, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an odd angle. It didn't move, just stared. My blood ran cold. I turned back quickly to the fire, heart pounding. My throat felt tight as I tried to act normal. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. What's wrong? One of my friends asked. Nothing, I muttered, but I couldn't shake the image. I didn't tell them what I saw. They would laugh, call me paranoid. But I knew what I saw. I was certain of it. And just as I convinced myself to forget about it, the silence broke again. A shrill, sharp cry from deeper in the woods, like a woman screaming. We all jumped, and for a moment, none of us moved. Did you hear that? Someone whispered. I nodded, trying to stay calm. It sounded too far to be anyone in trouble, but the fear in that scream made my skin crawl. We quickly packed up the fire. Our conversation dying out, we decided to turn in early. I crawled into my sleeping bag, heart still racing from the scream, but trying to force myself to sleep. As I lay in the dark, I heard something again, a soft rustling, too light to be a wild animal, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. Someone was moving around our campsite. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced at my friends, but they were asleep, oblivious. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped my tent. Stepping outside, the forest was pitch black. I shone the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. Just the overwhelming weight of silence pressing in on me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again, that tall figure. It was standing just at the edge of our campsite, hidden just enough to stay out of the light. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like my body had shut down. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until it was just on the edge of the light. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo in my mind, it spoke. You should have gone home. I stumbled back, too scared to scream, too terrified to move. The figure stepped forward again, but then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The air grew colder, and in that moment, I realized something. There was no sound, no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then the ground beneath us shook, a violent, bone-rattling tremor, and the figure vanished. Not into the shadows, not into the trees. It just disappeared. The shaking stopped as quickly as it had started, and the forest went eerily still. I didn't wait around to figure out what had just happened. I yelled for everyone to pack up, and we didn't stop until we were miles away from that place. We didn't speak much on the way back, but as we passed through the last stretch of woods, I saw something that made my stomach drop. That figure, standing in the trees, watching us. Only this time, it wasn't alone, there were more of them. The place we chose was remote, nestled deep in a forest where the only sound at night was the occasional hoot of an owl. The kind of place where you could get lost for days if you weren't careful. We set up camp just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, the glow of dusk filtering through the dense canopy. No one had ever been there before, but it was the perfect spot, quiet, peaceful, and far from the prying eyes of the world. Around the campfire, we joked, told stories, and roasted marshmallows, our laughter echoing off the trees. As darkness settled in, the forest around us grew still, and the cold night air made the fire feel even warmer. We were just beginning to relax when it happened. It started as a low rustling sound from the trees, too rhythmic to be an animal. We all stopped talking, staring into the shadows, trying to figure out what it was. The sound grew louder, and then, through the trees, came a soft whisper. At first, it was impossible to make out, but it seemed like it was calling our names. Faint but distinct. It felt wrong. Like something was waiting just beyond the firelight, watching us, knowing us. We all looked at each other, confused and uneasy. Probably just the wind, someone muttered. But even they sounded uncertain. We decided to go for a quick walk to stretch our legs and get some space from the unnerving whispers. The trees felt closer now, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out to trap us. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but the more I walked, the stronger that sensation grew. My skin prickled, and my heart rate quickened. It felt as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then we heard it clearer this time, unmistakable. Help. The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away. We stopped dead in our tracks, listening. The air was thick, and even though we couldn't see anything in the dark, we could all feel the presence. It was so real that I swore I could almost taste the fear in the air. The voice came again, and this time it was closer. Help me, please. We didn't know what to do. There was no one else out here. It was just us. But the voice was unmistakable, and against every ounce of common sense, we started following it, moving deeper into the forest. As we walked, the whispers got louder, more desperate, and that feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in on us, their shadows shifting and flickering in the dim light. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of it, lying on the ground, was a figure, a man. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his body stiff, and his face obscured by long, matted hair. For a moment, we stood there, frozen in disbelief. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge us. The whispers were now deafening, echoing all around us. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I stepped closer, the others following behind me. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and as my fingers brushed against him, his head snapped around, eyes wide open and black as coal. His lips curled into a grotesque smile, and before I could pull back, he hissed in a voice that was no longer human, "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The others were already running, not looking back, but I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or what the hell had just happened. Then, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I whipped around, expecting to see the figure again, but instead, it was one of my friends, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," he said. Voice shaking, we bolted back toward the camp, the forest seeming to stretch and warp around us, twisting the path like a maze. The whispers followed, growing louder, echoing in my head. As we reached the camp, I expected to find safety, but the fire was out. The tents had been torn apart. The place was a wreck, and that's when I saw the thing that made my blood run cold. Across the campfire's charred remains, written in the dirt, was one simple message: you were never meant to leave. It wasn't the forest we had gotten lost in. It was something far worse, something older, something that had been waiting for us to step into its domain. The woods didn't just hold the memories of the past, they held something far darker. And now, we knew the truth, the voice, the whispers, they were never meant to guide us out. They were meant to keep us there, trapped forever, but we had escaped, at least for now. And as we hurried back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Because, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw the figure standing by the side of the road, watching us drive away. I've always loved camping. There's something about the crisp air, the sound of rustling trees, and the crackle of a campfire that makes everything feel right. So, when my friends and I decided to spend the weekend out in the wilderness, I thought it would be just another fun, relaxing trip. We'd set up camp by a small creek, surrounded by dense trees and a clear, star-filled sky. Little did we know that this trip would be anything but relaxing. It started out like any other camping weekend. We pitched our tents, unpacked the gear, and made a fire. We joked and laughed as we roasted marshmallows, telling stories and enjoying the peace of the forest. But when night fell and the stars filled the sky, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the once comforting sounds of the forest became unnervingly silent. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to fade into a muffled hum. I was the first to notice the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, the rustling of branches or small animals scurrying about. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Slow, rhythmic steps circled the camp. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. The others didn't seem to hear anything, and we were all too tired to care. But the sound grew louder, more pronounced, and it wasn't just circling anymore, it was getting closer. I excused myself to the edge of the campsite, pretending to go to the bathroom, but really just needing some space to listen. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stepped away from the fire, leaving me in a thick silence. Then, from the trees beyond the camp, I heard a low growl. Not an animal growl, something deeper, almost human, but wrong in every sense. My heart began to race. I walked quickly back to the fire, but as soon as I crossed the threshold of the camp, the growling stopped, replaced by a soft voice calling my name. It was so quiet, I almost couldn't hear it, but there was something distinctly familiar about it. It was my voice, only it wasn't me. It sounded like a distorted, twisted version of me, echoing from the woods behind the campsite. I sat back down next to my friends, trying to act normal, though my mind was reeling. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The others continued to laugh, oblivious, as if nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night dragged on, and I kept my eyes on the trees, expecting anything to happen. Finally, when we decided to call it a night and retreat to our tents, I heard a sharp snap of a branch behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The camp was still. I crawled into my tent, unable to sleep. Every rustle of the trees, every creak of the wood outside made my skin crawl. I tried to close my eyes, but that's when I heard it again, a voice, calling my name. This time, it was right outside my tent. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't my voice this time. It was someone else's, a whisper full of malice and hunger. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I held my breath, hoping the sound would go away. It didn't. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and then I heard a low, unsettling chuckle that sent ice through my veins. I scrambled to unzip the tent, bursting out into the night air. But as I stood up, I saw something that froze me in place. My friends were standing near the fire, all of them staring into the woods with wide eyes. But they weren't looking at anything, they were staring at themselves. Their own faces, standing in the shadows, identical to the ones in front of me. There were more of them, twice as many as there should have been. I stumbled backward, horrified. The faces in the shadows moved, stepping forward, but the real versions of my friends stayed still, their eyes locked on the duplicates. I turned to them, my voice shaking as I asked, "What's going on? Who are they?" One of the figures in the shadows, the one that looked like me, smiled. It was a smile that was not mine, a twisted grin that sent a surge of terror through me. Then, the voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't calling my name. It was laughing. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The forest wasn't just watching us, it had been waiting for us. And now it had us all. The copies of us weren't just standing there. They were waiting for us to make the first move. They wanted us to break the silence, to show fear. But we didn't. We stood our ground, our real selves frozen in place, facing our monstrous doubles, staring into the night. And then, as if on cue, the air shifted. The footsteps returned, and from the darkness, a figure stepped forward, tall, thin, and dressed in tattered clothes, its face hidden behind a mask of old bark. It was time. The forest had claimed us. When I was invited to stay at a friend's new place, I was excited. It was an old Victorian-style house, the kind you imagine in stories. They had recently moved in, and we were supposed to be spending the weekend there, unpacking and setting things up. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, just the charm of the house, the antique furniture, the large, dimly lit rooms. But as soon as night fell, things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first. We were in the living room playing cards and chatting. My friend's dog was curled up by the fireplace, and we were having a good time. That's when I heard it, a soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was the house settling or the dog moving. But then there was another thud, followed by a dragging sound. I looked at my friend, but they didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, a little unsure of myself. "Hear what?" They replied, clearly distracted by the game. "I swear I heard something upstairs," I said. My voice quieter than I meant. They just waved it off, probably thinking it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and those noises, those dragging, faint sounds, they didn't sit right with me. Later, that night, around midnight, we were heading to bed. I took the guest room, which was at the far end of the hall. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm. I brushed it off, thinking the room might be poorly insulated. I laid down, trying to fall asleep, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. I could hear my heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen far below, and then more thuds. This time, they were louder. The floorboards creaked above me, followed by that dragging noise again. I shot up in bed. The dog had started barking downstairs, frantic and urgent. I didn't know what to do. I had always been skeptical about haunted house stories, but this felt different. There was something alive in that house, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my phone, prepared to text my friend, but before I could, the door to my room creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hall. No footsteps, no sound of the door handle turning. But there it was, the door wide open, letting in only darkness. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The dog's barking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence followed, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, willing it to close, to end this feeling of being watched. Then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from the hall. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not a human one. It was too deep, too gravelly, like something trying to speak through the walls. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare look into the hallway, but I could feel whatever it was there, watching me. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else, something that had been waiting. I finally managed to get my legs under me, and I ran out of the room, down the hallway. I was panicking now, heart pounding in my chest. I banged on my friend's door. They opened it, half asleep, but I could see they were immediately shaken by my expression. "What's wrong?" they asked, looking around. "You need to get out," I whispered, trying to control my breathing. "There's something in the house." "I heard it, it's here." They looked at me, their face a mix of confusion and concern. But before they could respond, the dragging sound returned. It was louder now, closer. I turned toward the stairs, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the dog. But the dog wasn't barking. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Its body was stiff, as if it had seen something it couldn't process. It was staring at something or someone that I couldn't see. I stepped back, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was savoring the moment. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My friend and I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, the dog turned and bolted toward the door. Without thinking, we followed. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care if we had to leave everything behind. I just had to get out. We made it to the car and drove off without looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I was shaking, my mind racing with what I had felt, what I had heard. But here's the part that still chills me to the bone. When I checked my phone, I saw I had a text from my friend. It had been sent hours earlier. While I was still in my room, it said simply, "You're not alone." We had been planning the weekend getaway for weeks, a group of 6 friends eager to escape city life. The cabin was located in a secluded forest, far from any distractions. When we arrived, the air was fresh, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine. We quickly settled in, enjoying the isolation and the silence of the surrounding woods. That first night, we stayed up late by the fire, drinking and chatting. It was peaceful, and none of us noticed anything strange. But around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a loud sound that disturbed me, just a low, almost imperceptible scraping noise. It was coming from outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it might be a branch rubbing against the glass, but as I listened, it didn't sound like wind or nature. It sounded deliberate, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I turned on the lamp and got out of bed, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I stood by the window for a few moments, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing, just the dim outline of trees swaying in the wind. The noise had stopped. Relieved, I climbed back into bed, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept drifting back to the strange scraping sound. It wasn't until I heard a knock, soft at first, that I sat bolt upright. Frozen, I crept to the door and opened it, scanning the hallway. Empty, quiet, everyone was still asleep. The knocking came again, louder this time, and it wasn't from the door, it was from downstairs, near the front door. A sudden chill swept over me. I couldn't explain why, but the atmosphere felt different, heavy, as though something was watching me. I debated waking everyone up, but I was terrified of what I might find if I did. So, I did nothing, just stood there in the hallway, listening. The knocking persisted, and the sound of dragging seemed to follow. I could hear it moving across the floorboards beneath me, slowly, with purpose. I don't know how much time passed before I finally gathered the courage to tiptoe downstairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon through the windows. My breath quickened as I approached the living room. When I turned the corner, I froze. The front door was wide open. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the empty doorway, unable to move. The cold air rushed in from outside, making the hairs on my neck stand up. It was too dark to see what was out there, but I felt something was out there. I rushed back up the stairs, woke everyone up, and told them what had happened. They all thought I was overreacting. They were convinced I had just imagined it, maybe the wind or some animal. We checked the door and locked it again, but the strange feeling never left. Everyone went back to bed, though I couldn't sleep a wink. I kept hearing that scraping sound, the knocking, faint but persistent. In the morning, everything felt off. The air was still thick with unease, and no one could shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something hadn't before. There were muddy footprints leading up to the open door, but they didn't stop there. They continued, spreading throughout the entire cabin, but they weren't human. They were too big. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. Everyone was eager to leave, and I didn't want to freak anyone out. We left the cabin without a second glance, but the unease stayed with me. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the worst part. When I looked in the mirror, I saw something on my neck, small, dark marks, almost like scratches, forming a circle. It looked as though something had been trying to grab me, but I hadn't felt it. I never told anyone about that. But now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cabin never really left. Every night, I hear the scraping sound again, just outside my window. And sometimes, when I wake up, I think I see the shadow of something standing in the doorway, waiting for me to open it, waiting for me to let it in. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to stories about creepy houses or strange occurrences. But that changed one weekend. My friends and I rented a house out in the woods for a getaway. The place was old, but charming, nestled in a clearing with towering trees surrounding it. We arrived late in the afternoon, the air crisp and cool, a perfect setting for a few days of escape. The house had this old-world charm-worn wooden floors, an overgrown garden, and creaking stairs that added to its character. That night, after dinner and drinks, we were all lounging around the living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. It wasn't long before we started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, spooky tales that only serve to make you laugh at how ridiculous they are. At least, that's what I thought. But then, Sarah, one of my friends, told us about the house's previous owner, an old woman who had lived there alone for years before passing away. People in the area said she had been eccentric, and some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows at night. I didn't think much of it, just more campfire fodder. But something about the way Sarah described it gave me an odd feeling, like she wasn't telling the whole story. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept in as I lay in my room, the wind howling outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the window, but then it came again, gentle, deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slowly, methodically. I was frozen, too terrified to move. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound was too close now, as if whoever or whatever was at the door was standing right outside. Then, a whisper, not a voice from inside the house, but from just beyond the door. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing heavily. I must have stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours, but eventually, the sound stopped. I was too scared to go back to sleep. So, us lay there in the dark, staring at the door. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the windows, and the house felt quieter, more ordinary. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened. I assumed it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had been stronger than I thought. But, as we were having breakfast, Sarah mentioned something odd. She said she had heard someone walking around outside her window in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything at first, but the others began sharing similar stories. Mark had heard a knock on his door. Emily had heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. We all chalked it up to nerves or old house creaks. But deep down, we all felt something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking through the woods, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We stayed out for hours, but when we returned to the house, the mood had shifted. The air felt thicker, and the house felt colder, though the fire was still burning in the hearth. It wasn't until later, that evening, that we finally saw something that didn't make sense. The front door, which we had all double-checked before leaving, was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Mark walked over to close it, and that's when we all saw it. At the foot of the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, muddy footprint. It was large, as if someone had been standing there, right outside. But no one had been outside the house when we were gone. The tension in the room was unbearable. We all stayed close together after that, too afraid to be alone. We heard no more tapping or whispers, but the air remained thick, oppressive. It was as if something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment. That night, after we had all retreated to our rooms, I heard it again. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard it from the other rooms too. We all got up, too scared to sleep, and met in the hallway. We walked down the stairs together, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The knocking stopped when we reached the door. We all stood there, eyes wide, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. I'll never forget the feeling of cold air rushing past us as we stared into the dark night beyond. And then, as if in response to our shock, we heard it, a laugh, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing from the trees outside. It was the old woman's laugh. But no one was there, nothing was there. We left the house the next morning, never looking back. I never liked working late, There's something eerie about being the only person left in a building when the lights flicker and the halls echo with your footsteps. But this was a deadline I couldn't ignore. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. As I typed away at my desk, my phone had died hours ago, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. The office was supposed to close at midnight, but everyone else had left, and I was alone, finishing up some last-minute work. I tried not to think about the strange occurrences that had been happening over the past few nights. At first, I chalked it up to being tired or paranoid, but now, something didn't feel right. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than they should have been, and every now and then, I could swear I heard something, a soft tap-tap, like fingernails on a desk. I shook it off. It was probably just the building settling, the air conditioning groaning. But as the sound persisted, I started to feel uneasy. The tap-tap became more frequent, like someone was walking around the office, except I was the only one here. My heart began to race. I glanced at the door. It was shut tight, as it had been all night. But then I heard something I couldn't ignore, a loud, distinct click, like a door unlocking. I froze, staring at the door. The office was locked. I was sure of it. I checked the entrance when everyone left, but now it was open a crack, just wide enough for someone or something to slip through. I stood up slowly, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. There was no way I was imagining this. I reached for my phone, but of course, it was dead. I didn't even have a flashlight. I couldn't afford to stay here any longer. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the door. As I stepped closer, I saw the silhouette of someone standing in the hallway. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and seemed to be staring straight at me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though its face was obscured by shadows. Panic surged through me, but before I could react, the figure slowly turned and walked down the hallway, its footsteps echoing off the walls. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to cooperate. Then the sound came again, tap tap tap, louder now, like it was walking toward me. I turned to look, my stomach dropping as I saw the figure reappear at the end of the hallway. This time, it was closer. It was no longer walking, it was floating toward me, gliding across the floor with an eerie smoothness. And as it neared, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. There was just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should be. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing continued to glide closer, and I realized I couldn't escape. The exit was too far, and the figure was moving faster than I could. But just as I thought I was about to be caught, the figure stopped. It hovered in place, and for a long moment, it did nothing. My breath came in sharp gasps, my body frozen in fear, and then I heard a voice. Not from the figure, but from somewhere deeper in the office. "Why are you still here?" The voice was faint, like it came from behind a wall, but the question struck me to my core. It was not an accusation, but a statement. Why was I still here? I didn't have an answer. I couldn't think of one. I just wanted to get out, but before I could move, the lights above me flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging the office into total darkness. I heard the figure move again, closer now. Its footsteps were right behind me, growing louder, faster, as if it was closing in. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, silent office. I ran to the door and yanked it open, stumbling into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I made it to the stairwell and down to the lobby. As I burst through the front door into the night air, I could finally breathe again. The next day, I went to the office early, hoping I had just imagined the whole thing. But when I arrived, everything seemed off. The lights were flickering, and the air felt thick, as if it had been waiting for me. I went to my desk, and there, sitting right in the middle, was my phone fully charged and open to a message that hadn't been there before. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Don't come back." I didn't return to the office after that. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it's still watching. And I have no idea what it wants, but I know one thing for sure: I won't be working late again. The old library was as quiet as a tomb, but that was part of its charm. It was an ancient building with towering shelves that groaned under the weight of hundreds of thousands of books. I loved it, despite its creaking floors and dim, flickering lights. It was the one place I felt truly at peace, away from the noise and chaos of the world. I'd been working there as a night custodian for months, a job that suited me perfectly. On this particular night, I was finishing my last sweep of the upper floor, the one with the old, leather-bound volumes. The air was heavy with the scent of paper and dust, and the silence seemed almost to press against my eardrums. I just rounded a corner when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone's nails drumming against a desk. I paused, peering into the shadows. The sound had come from the far end of the room, where the dim light barely reached. I should have told myself it was just my imagination, but the chill creeping up my spine told me otherwise. My heart pounded as I moved toward the noise, each step louder than the last in the oppressive silence. As I neared the sound, the tapping stopped abruptly. I stopped too, breath caught in my throat. The library was as still as before, except now I could hear my own heartbeat, echoing in the empty room. I glanced around nervously, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back. That's when I saw it. A book, on a pedestal near the window, was open, its pages fluttering as though someone had just turned them. But there was no breeze. I took a cautious step forward, eyes fixed on the book. The words written in old, spidery script seemed to twist and rearrange before my eyes, forming a sentence that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here." I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned to run, but a low, guttural growl stopped me in my tracks. The growl came from the direction of the rows of bookshelves, the sound of something heavy moving through the dark. My mind raced as I strained to see what was there. I caught a glimpse of something dark, with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. It was as if the creature was made from the pages of the books themselves, its form shifting and warping in a grotesque dance. I sprinted toward the stairs, my fingers fumbling for the keys on my belt. My heart was in my throat as I threw open the exit door, slamming it behind me and locking it as fast as I could. The growl continued, but now it was muffled, fading behind the thick, old wood. I stood there in the dark hallway, gasping for air, sweat pouring down my face. The echo of the creature's movements seemed to reverberate in my bones, even through the closed door. I stumbled back, barely keeping my balance, and caught my reflection in a window. My eyes were wide, my pupils dilated, but then I saw it, a shadow, dark and thin, creeping across the glass from the inside. My pulse skyrocketed as I felt an icy, bony hand rest on my shoulder. I whipped around to find no one there. The library was silent again, but I knew better now. It was waiting, watching, and it knew my fear. I stumbled toward the exit, never taking my eyes off the dark windows. That night, I learned the hard way that some places keep their secrets locked between their pages, waiting for a visitor foolish enough to read them, and I was never going back.